It was the kind of late summer night where the air smells like dust and pine needles and the horizon seems endless. My friends and I had decided to take a road trip through northern Arizona, mostly for the thrill of being somewhere remote, somewhere you could drive for hours and not see another soul. There were four of us: me, Jake, Monica, and Sam. We were all in our mid-20s, looking for a weekend of adventure and freedom. None of us expected that by the end of the trip, we'd be telling people we'd almost died, or at least felt like we had. We left Phoenix mid-afternoon on a Friday, taking Route 89 north. The highway was smooth at first, lined with scrub brush and low hills. We were blasting music, joking about how out in the middle of nowhere we'd get. But as the sun dipped lower, the landscape changed. The hills became jagged, the trees thicker, and the roads narrower, winding through canyons and under overhanging cliffs. Cell service became spotty, but that only added to the excitement. Jake was driving, Monica beside him, Sam in the back with me. The car felt alive with energy, everyone chatting, laughing, until a point when the road became little more than a two-lane dirt track carved into the side of a hill. Dust rose behind us, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The GPS was flickering, saying, recalculating, repeatedly. We were definitely off the main highway, though no one could remember exactly where we had turned. After what felt like an hour of winding through the canyon, we saw it. A small abandoned gas station, rusted and falling apart, sitting alone in the middle of the desert. One pump leaned at an awkward angle, windows were cracked, and the paint was peeling. There wasn't another sign of civilization for miles. We joked about it being the perfect horror movie set, but none of us wanted to stop. Yet, a part of me felt drawn to it, an unexplainable pull. The first night, we set up camp about half a mile past the gas station along a flat stretch near some low pines. We built a small fire, drank, and told stories, trying to shake the feeling that the desert was watching us. As darkness fell, it was astonishingly quiet. No wind, no insects, no animals. The silence itself was unsettling, more oppressive than the heat from earlier in the day. Around 2 a.m., Sam woke me up. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I thought he was joking, but then I heard it too. Faint footsteps, crunching across the dirt nearby. Not far off, but not close enough to identify what or who it was. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it across the darkness, but saw nothing. Only desert stretching endlessly, the shadows of the trees swaying slightly. Monica stirred, groaning. "It's probably just an animal," she said, though the hesitation in her voice betrayed her doubt. The footsteps came again, closer this time. My stomach dropped. Whatever it wasn't making normal animal sounds. There were no growls, no rustles, just precise, deliberate steps, like someone pacing slowly in the dark, keeping track of us. Jake grabbed a baseball bat from the trunk. "No one's messing with us out here," he muttered, but his voice was tight, unconvincing. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, flashlights scanning the perimeter, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But every time one of us looked away, we thought we saw movement at the edge of the firelight. Shapes, shadows that weren't quite trees. By dawn, we were exhausted, but too paranoid to sleep. The next day, we decided to hike a nearby trail to clear our heads. The trail was narrow, barely marked, snaking through rocks and scrub. As we went deeper, we realized something was off. The trail seemed to loop back on itself, though according to the map, it shouldn't. Every turn looked familiar, as if we had passed the same boulder or twisted tree multiple times. Then Sam stopped abruptly. "Wait, I think we just passed the same rock again," he said, pointing. Monica frowned. "That can't be right. We've been going straight." Jake checked his phone for GPS. It read, "No service." The map showed the trail continuing, but the blue dot marking us remained frustratingly stationary, as if we were moving in circles without realizing it. We pressed on, unease growing with every step. Then we heard it, a low, guttural humming. At first, it was so faint we thought it was the wind, but it grew steadily, echoing off the rocks, following us along the trail. It wasn't a tune, not exactly, more like a chant, or a wordless call meant to make your chest tighten. We broke into a run, stumbling over rocks and roots, trying to find our way back to the car. The humming grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be surrounding us. My ears rang, my heart pounded, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We reached the clearing where we'd parked the car. The sight of it brought temporary relief, but as we neared, something made us freeze. The gas station we had passed the previous night was no longer there. Not gone in the sense of deteriorating, it was as if it had never existed, just open desert stretching for miles. Panic set in. We jumped in the car, fumbling to start the engine. Dust swirled around us. And then, from the darkness behind the trees lining the desert, we saw movement. A figure impossibly tall, thin, almost skeletal, stepping slowly into the dirt track. Its limbs moved jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't fully human. It stopped, turned its head toward us. No facial features, or at least none we could recognize. Just darkness, empty and hungry. Jake floored the gas pedal. Tires spun, gravel spraying as we tore down the dirt road. The figure didn't move quickly, but it followed. Not running, walking. But we could see it keep pace, drifting behind the trees, following the car like a predator that didn't need speed to kill. Hours, or maybe minutes later, I don't know, we stumbled onto a main highway. The figure was gone. The desert looked normal again. We didn't speak. We didn't stop driving until we hit Flagstaff. We told ourselves it was a hallucination, a stress reaction to being in the middle of nowhere. But the scratches on Sam's arm, the deep, uneven marks from fingernails he swore he didn't feel while they were being made, told a different story. The others had marks too, subtle scratches on arms and legs that couldn't be explained. None of us ever went back. None of us drove down another dirt road in that area. We don't talk about what followed us that night, but sometimes I swear I can still hear the low humming just under the threshold of reality. Years later, I learned that the area where we camped had a history of hikers disappearing without a trace. Not many, but enough that locals whispered about it. And every time I see someone post a photo of that stretch of northern Arizona desert, I feel the same pull I felt that night. The sense that something is watching, waiting for the next group foolish enough to wander into the middle of nowhere. We got lucky. Or maybe not. Some nights, I wonder if it's still out there, following the desert roads, waiting for anyone who dares to drive too far from the safety of the highway. Story the end. It was sometime 11:30 at night when my car died on that endless stretch of two-lane highway somewhere between Flagstaff and the Utah border. I had been driving for hours, alone, the windows down because the AC had quit months ago, and the desert air had turned sharp and dry as the sun went down. There was no traffic, not even a single pair of headlights in either direction, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was before the engine coughed twice and then went completely silent. The dashboard lights flickered once, then the whole car went dark. I coasted onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires as I stopped. I sat there for a while, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the blackness stretching out in both directions. No gas stations, no signs of civilization, nothing but low shrubs, open desert, and that soft whistling sound of wind through the cracks in my window. I didn't panic right away because I thought it had to be something simple, maybe a loose cable, maybe the alternator. But when I tried to start the car again, the key clicked once and then nothing. Not even the dashboard lights came back on. I reached for my phone. The screen lit up, but the signal bar was empty. No service, just SOS only. I cursed under my breath and leaned back in the seat, running a hand down my face. I had passed a small diner about 50 miles back, the kind of roadside place with flickering neon lights and maybe one pickup in the lot. But since then, nothing. My GPS had gone out miles before, and I hadn't seen another car since. I thought about waiting until morning, but the temperature was already dropping fast. The desert at night isn't warm, it's freezing. I decided I'd give it 30 minutes. If no one drove by, I'd start walking in the direction I'd been heading. There had to be something up ahead eventually. A town, a gas station, anything. I turned off the car completely just to save what little battery I might have left, and sat there with the windows cracked. The moon was high, thin, and cold, casting that silvery light that makes the landscape look almost unreal. The longer I sat, the more I realized just how empty it was out there. No sound of insects, no cars, no planes overhead. Just the wind and that constant feeling of being watched, even though there was no one around. After about 45 minutes of nothing, I decided to go. I grabbed my flashlight, my phone, and a small bottle of water from the passenger seat. I zipped my jacket up and started walking along the road, heading north. The asphalt stretched out like a ribbon into the dark. My flashlight beam picked out bits of white paint and rocks at the edges of the road, but beyond that was total blackness. I walked for maybe an hour before I saw something. A faint orange glow way out ahead, just above the horizon. At first I thought it was headlights, but the light didn't move. It just stayed in one place, flickering. A campfire, maybe, or a house. Either way, it was something. As I got closer, the shape of a building started to form. A small structure, maybe a shack or a cabin. It sat a few yards off the road behind a low fence. There was definitely a fire burning outside it, and what looked like an old pickup parked in the dirt beside it. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing weirdly in the open space. No answer. I called again, waving my flashlight toward the house. The fire popped once, but there was no movement. I felt hesitant, but the cold was biting through my clothes, and the idea of a fire, of warmth, was enough to push me forward. As I got close to the fence, I noticed how strange the place looked. The house was small, maybe one story, but the boards on the outside were old and dry, like it had been sitting there abandoned for decades. The fire burned low in a metal barrel beside the porch, and a few folding chairs were scattered around it. "Hello?" I said again, stepping up to the fence. "My car broke down. Is anyone here?" Still nothing. I shined my flashlight across the chairs. One of them was knocked over. The other two were upright, but empty. There was a pot sitting near the fire, and what looked like a sleeping bag rolled up near the porch. The whole setup looked recent, not abandoned long ago. Someone had been here, maybe even tonight. I pushed open the creaky wooden gate and walked closer. My boots crunched on the gravel. The air smelled faintly like smoke and something else, something metallic and sour. I reached the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed hollowly through the house. No answer. I waited, knocked again, louder this time. The third time, the door moved slightly. Not from my knock, from the inside. Just a subtle shift, like something bumped it. I froze. "Hello?" I said, backing up slightly. I don't mean to bother you. My car broke down and I was just hoping." The door creaked open another inch, slow enough that I thought maybe it was just the wind. Then something moved inside. It wasn't clear, just a shadow. A shape that crossed the thin line of light spilling from my flashlight into the room. I lifted the beam slightly, but the glare reflected off the dusty window beside the door. "Is someone in there?" I asked again, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. For a long moment, nothing. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps, coming closer from inside. My heart jumped. "Hey, I just need to use a phone, that's all," I said, trying to sound calm. The steps stopped right behind the door. I waited, holding my breath. Then the door opened completely. The light from my flashlight spilled into a narrow hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. No one stood there. The air that came out smelled musty, like old wood and something rotting. "Hello?" I said again. Still nothing. I stepped back toward the fire barrel. Maybe whoever lived here didn't want company. Maybe I should just keep walking and wait for daylight. But as I turned away, I caught sight of something through the open doorway, a photograph hanging crooked on the wall. It was a family portrait. A man, a woman, and two kids, maybe 10 and 12. They stood in front of that same house. But the picture was faded, old. The truck in the photo was the same one sitting beside the house, but it looked newer in the picture. Bright red, shiny. Now it was covered in dust and rust. Something about that picture pulled me in. I took another step toward the door, shining my flashlight deeper inside. The floorboards creaked softly as the wind moved through the house. Then, faintly, from somewhere down the hallway, I heard a sound, like a door closing. Not slammed, just shut, quietly. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I turned off my flashlight instinctively, standing in total darkness. My breath was loud in the cold air. For a few seconds, I heard nothing. Then, from deeper inside the house, a faint, dragging sound started. Slow, uneven, like something being pulled across the floor. I turned and bolted. I didn't look back. I ran past the fire, out through the fence, and back to the road, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't stop running until the house was just a dark blur behind me. I must have walked another hour before I saw headlights. Real ones this time, coming up behind me. I waved my arms frantically, and an old semi slowed to a stop beside me. The driver, a man in his 50s, leaned out and asked if I was okay. I told him my car broke down a few miles back. He nodded and told me to hop in. I climbed up into the cab, still shaking. The heat blasted from the vents, and it felt like heaven. The driver introduced himself as Mike. He asked if I'd been walking long. I told him about the house I'd seen, about the fire and the photo and the noise inside. He didn't say anything for a while, just stared at the road ahead. Finally, he said, "You saw that old shack off 163? Yeah, I said. You know it? He nodded slowly. Yeah, everyone around here knows it, but it's been empty for, close to 15 years now. I frowned. That's not possible. There was a fire burning outside, and that truck. He cut me off. That truck's been sitting there since the accident. I looked at him. What accident? He hesitated. Family used to live there. The father worked the mines up in Ely. One night, his truck caught fire right outside that house. Whole thing went up. Killed him and his wife. Kids made it out, but disappeared before morning. Sheriff figured they wandered into the desert and got lost. I just stared at him, trying to process it. Mike glanced over at me. You sure that fire was burning? I nodded slowly. Yeah, I saw it, and I heard someone inside. He didn't respond. We drove the next few miles in silence. The desert rolled by outside the window, endless and dark. I tried to convince myself that maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe the firelight was just moonlight. Maybe the sounds were animals. But part of me knew better. When we passed my car, we slowed down, but I told him to just keep going. I didn't want to stop. Not there. Mike dropped me at a small motel outside Kanab just after 3 a.m. He gave me his number, told me to call a tow in the morning. Before he drove off, he said quietly, "If I were you, kid, I wouldn't go back out there." I didn't plan to. But the next morning I had to. The tow company wanted me there to sign papers before they could move the car. I told myself it would be quick. When I got there around 9, the sun was already high. The air was dry and still. My car sat exactly where I'd left it. But something was wrong. The hood was up. I hadn't left it like that. The tow driver, a big guy with a beard, met me on the shoulder. "You been out here already?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." "Why?" He pointed to the hood. "Somebody popped it." He looked around, then added, "We get tweakers out here sometimes. They strip cars for copper and scrap." He hooked the car up to the tow rig while I looked around. Off in the distance, I could see the outline of that same shack, maybe a mile or two away. In the daylight, it looked even more ruined. The boards blackened, the windows shattered. The truck by the porch looked like nothing but a shell. I almost said something, but decided not to. When we got back to town, the mechanic opened the hood and frowned. "Weird," he muttered. "What?" I asked. He pointed to the inside of the engine compartment. "See that? Battery's gone. So are the plugs. But the cables are still attached, like they were just pulled out clean." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that dragging sound, about the open door, about the photo on the wall. 2 days later, I got a call from the tow driver. He said, "You're not going to believe this. Someone broke into my yard last night. Just one car touched. Yours. Battery gone again." That was 3 years ago. I sold that car and moved back east. But every once in a while, I dream about walking that road again, about seeing the firelight flicker just over the horizon, and the sound of footsteps behind a thin wooden door. I tell myself it was all in my head. But every time I think about it, I remember one last thing. When I looked into that house before I ran, the family photo wasn't hanging crooked anymore. It was perfectly straight. Story the end. It was the kind of Friday evening that seemed ordinary at first, the kind you'd pass off as any other, but the kind that lingers in your memory years later because it wasn't ordinary at all. I had spent the day in my small apartment in Boise, Idaho, scrolling through Reddit threads and staring out the window at the mountains that framed the city. My buddy Mike had called me earlier that week, excitedly talking about a weekend getaway up in the Sawtooth National Forest. He had this idea. He said it was off the grid, untouched, middle of nowhere, a camping trip for two guys looking to escape phones, people, and responsibilities. The problem was that it was late September, and I'm not the type to just hop into the woods without preparation. But Mike has this way of selling things, talking fast and convincing you it's the greatest idea you've ever had. And by Friday night, I found myself loading my truck with a small backpack, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of sandwiches and beer, and a large bottle of water. We met at his place just after 6. Mike was grinning like a kid, a map spread out across his kitchen table, markers scribbled everywhere. "Trust me, man," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that was barely a dot. "This place doesn't even show up on Google Maps. It's perfect. Just woods, silence, maybe a creek, maybe a little abandoned cabin if we're lucky." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but the allure of the unknown plus Mike's enthusiasm won me over. We hit the road just as the sun started dipping behind the mountains, turning the sky a deep orange. The drive itself was uneventful at first. We stuck to paved roads for a few hours, making small talk, listening to a mixtape Mike had burned for the trip. Around 9 o'clock, we took a sharp right off a winding highway onto a dirt road that got progressively narrower, overgrown with bushes and pine branches scraping the sides of the truck. "This is where the fun begins," Mike said, laughing, though I could feel the tension in the air. The further we drove, the more isolated it became. Streetlights disappeared, houses became non-existent, and eventually the only thing around us was black forest. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, revealing twisted trees and thick underbrush. At one point, I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't make sense, but I chalked it up to exhaustion and poor visibility. After about 30 more minutes of driving, the dirt road ended at a small clearing, a flat patch of ground that seemed like it had once been used as a campsite. There was no cabin, no creek, just trees and a strange, heavy silence that pressed down on you. Mike parked, cut the engine, and leaned back, stretching. "This is it," he said. I got out and immediately noticed how cold it was, even for September, and how unnervingly quiet the forest was. We set up camp in the clearing, pitching a small tent and starting a fire. The flames cast long shadows over the trees, and for a moment I felt a strange thrill. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, you feel small in a way that city life never allows. The stars were incredible, millions of points of light piercing the sky. I couldn't help but feel awed and uneasy at the same time. Mike cracked a beer and offered me one. "To the middle of nowhere," he said. I clinked my bottle against his. We spent the next couple of hours talking, sharing stories, joking about being lost in the woods, or about running into bears or crazies who lived off-grid. I started to feel my anxiety fade, replaced by that strange camaraderie you get when two people are alone in the wilderness. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. Not the usual night sounds, the distant rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, or the call of an owl. Nothing. I mentioned it to Mike. "It's the middle of nowhere, man. No city, no people. That's the silence you're hearing," he said, though his voice didn't quite have the conviction it had earlier. We decided to call it a night, climbing into the tent. I was the first to fall asleep, but I didn't sleep well. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but it was rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps, crunching leaves, getting closer. I froze, straining my ears. Mike was asleep, breathing heavily beside me. I wanted to wake him, but something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't just footsteps. It had a weight to it, like someone was carrying something or dragging it. The noise circled the tent, slow and methodical. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might wake Mike. Then it stopped. I whispered his name. No response. I unzipped the tent slightly, just enough to peer out. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. I sat there, paralyzed for what felt like forever. Then I thought I saw a figure, a person, standing at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I shook Mike awake. "Mike, someone's out there," he groaned, sitting up. "What? No, you're dreaming, man. Go back to sleep," I insisted, describing what I'd seen. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the clearing. Nothing. "Maybe a deer or something," he said, though even he looked uneasy. We stayed awake for a while, scanning the darkness, but nothing returned. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it had been an animal or a trick of the light. The next morning, we tried to shrug off the unease. We packed a small breakfast and talked about hiking a little trail Mike had seen on the map. The sun had come up, and the forest seemed less oppressive in daylight. But as we hiked, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, large, humanoid, but not human in shape, elongated, almost like claws. "Weird," Mike said, frowning. He crouched to examine them. "Could be an animal," he muttered, but his voice was tight. We didn't go far, maybe a mile or so, when the first sign of real danger appeared. A tree in the distance had been chopped halfway through, not by humans with proper tools, but hacked in a messy, brutal way. The sight unsettled me, a sense of wrongness creeping into my gut. Mike tried to laugh it off. Old hunters? Some kids messing around? I didn't believe him. There was something in the air now, heavy, oppressive. We decided to cut the hike short. On our way back, the sun was lowering and shadows grew long and twisted. That's when we heard it again. The footsteps, this time more deliberate, following us. Mike didn't hear them at first, but I did. Every step we took seemed to be mirrored by a step behind us. The trees loomed closer and a cold wind picked up, making the branches scrape and groan like tortured souls. By the time we reached the clearing, the firewood we had gathered was gone. Not scattered, just missing. I looked at Mike, my fear now raw and palpable. We need to leave. Now. We packed the tent frantically, tossing things into the truck. I started it and we took off down the dirt road. But something was wrong. The road, the landmarks, they didn't look familiar. We drove for hours, but the same trees kept appearing, the same twists in the road, as if the forest itself was reshaping around us. Our cell phones had no signal, GPS was useless, and every turn led us back to the same clearing where we had camped. By late afternoon, exhaustion had set in. We stopped to rest, and that's when I noticed something in the trees, something moving, just beyond the reach of the headlights. A tall, thin figure, impossibly still, watching us. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like it had been stretched, and it didn't run or walk. It glided, almost floating. I froze. Mike saw it too and went pale. We tried driving again, screaming down dirt roads, praying we would hit a real highway. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped drastically. Fog rolled in, thick and blinding, and the figure appeared intermittently, always just on the edge of light, always following. Panic took over. I floored the truck, tires digging into gravel, heart hammering. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed warped, and eventually we hit a rickety wooden sign, partially obscured by fog. It read, "Welcome to Remington." The letters were faded, barely legible. Confused, I realized this was not a town we had planned to pass through. Mike shook his head. "We haven't seen anything like this on the map." We drove through, and the town was empty. Houses, shops, streets, all abandoned, overgrown with weeds. Not a single car, not a single light. And then the figure appeared again, standing in the middle of the road ahead. This time, it didn't move. It was taller than any human should be, thin, with long arms and dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the fog. Mike screamed, swerving to avoid it, but the road twisted unnaturally, as if the town itself was alive, manipulating us. We didn't stop until we saw a faint glow in the distance, a flicker of movement that resembled life. It turned out to be a small gas station, still operational, with a single attendant, an older man who looked at us like we'd emerged from a nightmare. We pulled in, shaken, explaining nothing, because words wouldn't convey the terror. The man just nodded. "You shouldn't have come through here," he said quietly, filling our tank. "Not many do. Not since." He trailed off and we didn't press. We left immediately, following the faint roads that seemed to match the GPS again. Eventually, we broke free of the forest, back onto the highway, the figure never appearing again. We drove in silence until we reached Boise, sun rising behind us, exhausted and haunted. We never returned to the forest. We never spoke much about it, only occasionally in hushed tones when reminiscing about a weekend that had gone horribly wrong. I still can't explain the figure, the endlessly shifting dirt roads, or the town that didn't exist on any map. And sometimes when I drive late at night through empty stretches of road with trees pressing in on either side, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they're brave enough to go off the grid. Years later, I looked up that area on satellite maps, trying to rationalize what had happened. Nothing matched. The forest was continuous, unbroken, no clearing, no trails, no abandoned town. And I know what I saw. I know what followed us. It's the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the world seems to stop and reality stretches into something unrecognizable. The kind of place that waits. Story the end. It was supposed to be just a long drive through the back roads of Nevada, the kind of trip that clears your mind. I'd been working in logistics for 6 years, living in Las Vegas, but constantly running routes across the western states. That week, My schedule had opened up, and I decided to take a few days to drive north toward Idaho, just to see the open desert, maybe camp along the way. I wasn't looking for adventure, just silence. A break from people, phones, and noise. I left early on a Thursday morning. The city lights faded fast behind me, replaced by an ocean of tan earth and scrub brush stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. The hum of the tires against asphalt was the only sound. The air felt lighter as the desert widened, the sun climbing higher. I'd filled up my tank, stocked the truck with water, jerky, a first aid kit, and a tent. The map showed a narrow secondary road, State Route 722, that cut through the middle of nowhere before reconnecting with Highway 50 near Austin. It was a shortcut, but I didn't care about saving time. I just wanted the emptiness. By mid-afternoon, the desert started to swallow the road. The heat shimmered, distorting the horizon, turning the mountains into floating shadows. Every now and then, a dust devil spun across the flats. The radio had lost signal an hour ago. My phone had no bars. There were no cars, no towns, just the cracked roads slicing through the endless beige. I rolled the windows down and let the dry wind rush through. Around 4, the sky began to change. Clouds drifted in from the west, dark, swollen ones that carried the smell of rain. That surprised me. I didn't think it rained much out here. The wind picked up, sweeping sand across the road in little rivers. I figured I'd find a spot to camp before the storm hit, somewhere flat and open where I could set up the tent quickly. But the farther I went, the fewer pull-offs I saw. The road narrowed, cracked more, then turned to faded gravel. There was a green road sign ahead, half rusted, almost illegible. I slowed down to read it. The paint was worn to gray, but I could just make out Hollow Creek, 12 miles. I'd never heard of it. Probably one of those ghost towns you read about. Places left behind after the mines shut down. But 12 miles didn't sound bad, and the idea of sleeping inside a structure, even a ruined one, sounded better than pitching a tent in the wind. The rain began as a soft hiss against the windshield. It smelled like dust and iron. The road snaked between low hills, climbing slightly. I passed a wooden post with a faded cattle crossing sign, but no fences, no cows, just emptiness. Then, after another 20 minutes, I saw the remnants of a wooden gate and a dirt road veering right, the sign beside it marked Hollow Creek. The dirt road was rutted and muddy from the rain, but I followed it anyway, creeping along at maybe 10 miles an hour. The hills flattened out again, revealing a wide valley ahead. That's when I saw it. Hollow Creek wasn't much. A handful of buildings clustered near a dry riverbed. Wooden houses bleached gray by the sun, roofs collapsed, windows empty. The main street was more mud than road, and the only sign of life was the wind slamming an old screen door against a wall. Still, it felt like shelter. I parked near what looked like an old general store, the faded lettering barely visible on the boards. When I stepped out, the air was colder than I expected, the rain heavier. I could hear thunder rolling miles away. The wind carried a low hum through the empty town, a sound that didn't seem entirely natural. I told myself it was just the way the wind moved through those hollowed-out buildings. I grabbed my flashlight, backpack, and jacket, and went to check the store first. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, but opened with a push. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and rot. The floorboards groaned under my boots. Shelves still lined the walls, though most had collapsed, spilling old tin cans and glass bottles. In the back, I found a small storage room with a patch of relatively dry floor. That would do for the night. I returned to the truck to grab my sleeping bag. The rain had turned into a steady downpour now, drumming against the metal roof. As I hurried back inside, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine. These were smaller, lighter, and led from one of the houses down the street toward the store. I froze for a second, looking around, but the rain blurred everything. It was getting darker fast. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe old tracks that had held their shape in the mud. Still, I locked the store door when I went back inside. The lock barely worked, but it made me feel better. I spread out my sleeping bag, ate some jerky, and tried to settle down as the wind howled outside. By 8, it was pitch black. The flashlight beam caught the swirling dust in the air, and every creak of the building made me jump. I tried turning on the radio, but there was only static. I eventually turned it off, sat in silence, and listened to the storm. Then, sometime around 10, I heard footsteps on the porch. It wasn't the rain or the wind. This was slow, deliberate human. My chest tightened. The steps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, but none came. Just silence. Then the faint sound of something brushing against the wall, like fingers dragging over the wood. I switched off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My heart hammered in my ears. The sound moved again to the side window, then stopped. I could hear the rain dripping off the roof, the wind howling, but beneath it all, a faint scrape like nails on glass. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, barely breathing. Then the sound stopped altogether. No movement, no footsteps. I told myself it had to be a branch or an animal. I forced myself to believe that until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke, it was dawn. The rain had stopped. The town was wrapped in fog that clung to the ground like smoke. Everything looked colorless, washed out. I unzipped my sleeping bag and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp. I immediately noticed the footprints again, but now there were more of them, circling the building. Some led toward the street, others toward the dry creek bed. They were fresh. I scanned the empty houses, the pale mist swirling between them. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. I thought about leaving right then, but the road had turned to sludge overnight, and I wasn't sure my truck would make it up the hill without getting stuck. I decided to wait hours for the ground to dry a little. I figured I'd walk around, maybe see if there was something worth photographing. The first few houses were mostly the same: rotted walls, old furniture, and silence. In one, a small wooden chair sat perfectly upright in the middle of the room, coated in dust but untouched otherwise. Another had a set of children's shoes near the door. They were tiny, probably from the 1940s or earlier. I found what must have been the town church near the end of the street, a white building with half the steeple missing. The door creaked open when I pushed it, revealing rows of pews warped with age. There were still hymnals on some benches, their pages yellowed. The air inside felt colder than outside. My breath fogged faintly, even though it wasn't that cold. Something about the place unsettled me more than the others. It wasn't just the decay. It felt like the church was holding its breath. I took a few steps down the aisle, my boots echoing. Then I saw it. A single candle sat on the altar. It was burned down almost to the base, but still warm, like it had been lit not long ago. I stopped dead. My first thought was that someone else must be here, maybe another traveler who had taken shelter. But there were no signs of life. No packs, no footprints near the altar. Just that candle, its wax still soft. I backed out slowly, scanning the fog through the doorway. The town looked the same, empty, but the silence now pressed against my ears. Thicker, heavier. I didn't like it. I turned and walked quickly back toward the truck. Halfway there, I saw movement. A shadow slipping between two buildings at the far end of the street. It was gone before I could focus on it, but I swear it was shaped like a person. That was enough for me. I threw my gear into the passenger seat, started the engine, and reversed toward the main road. The tires spun in the mud before catching. As I started climbing the hill, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing in the middle of the street. It was too far to see details, but the shape was human. Tall, thin, motionless, watching. I blinked, looked again. They were gone. By the time I reached the main road, my hands were shaking. I didn't stop until I'd driven 15 miles. The rain had started again, though lighter now, and I finally let myself breathe. I kept driving for hours, past valleys and ridges that all looked the same. Eventually, the fuel light came on, and I realized I hadn't seen another car or gas station since leaving the highway the day before. My phone still had no service. I began to wonder if I'd taken the wrong turn somewhere, though I couldn't remember seeing any forks in the road. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape grew stranger. The road turned from gravel to cracked asphalt again, but there were no markers, no signs. The hills looked unfamiliar, darker, sharper somehow. I checked the odometer and realized I'd driven over 60 miles without connecting back to Highway 50. That wasn't possible. When the sun dipped low, I spotted something ahead, an old gas pump beside a shack. Relief hit me like a wave. I pulled up, cut the engine, and stepped out. The sign above the door read, Hollow Creek General. My stomach dropped. It was the same building, The same collapsed awning, the same screen door hanging loose. My tire tracks were still faintly visible in the mud. Somehow, I was back where I'd started. For a moment, I thought I was losing it. I checked my GPS again. Still no signal, the screen frozen. The compass app spun in circles. My watch had stopped too, stuck at 3:17. I stood there in the rain, staring at the silent town. The fog had returned, thicker now, clinging to the rooftops. The air smelled faintly of smoke. I didn't want to go back inside, but the thought of driving further into the dark with no gas wasn't much better. Then I heard something, faint, from somewhere down the street. A voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and low, calling out a name I couldn't quite catch. It sounded like it was coming from the church. I should have left. I should have ignored it, gotten in the truck, and driven until the tank was bone dry. But something in that voice wasn't threatening. It was pleading. Desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the sound. The beam cut through the fog in weak arcs. Every step felt heavier. The air was colder again. I could hear the voice clearer now, repeating that same name over and over, though the syllables blurred with the wind. When I reached the church, the door was wide open this time. The candle on the altar was lit again, burning tall and steady. And there, standing just beside it, was a figure. A woman. Her dress was pale gray, torn near the hem. Her hair hung wet over her shoulders, and her face, God, her face, looked like it had been blurred, like my eyes couldn't focus on it. She turned slowly toward me, her movements too smooth, too quiet. I froze, unable to speak. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The candle flickered violently. The air around me dropped to freezing in an instant. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pew. The light went out. The darkness swallowed everything. Something moved in that darkness, fast. All around me, I could hear breathing, ragged, harsh. Then fingers brushed my neck. I swung my flashlight wildly, but it flickered and died. I ran. I don't even remember how I got out. I just remember the cold, the fog, and the sound of footsteps chasing me until I slammed the truck door shut and jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. I floored it, wheels spitting mud. As I tore down the road, the headlights caught movement in the fog again. Dozens of shapes along the sides of the street, standing still, watching me go. Their faces weren't faces, just hollow, pale ovals. I didn't look back again. Hours later, maybe dawn, I finally saw a sign for Highway 50. The world seemed brighter, warmer. My phone buzzed suddenly, reconnecting to the network. I pulled over just long enough to check my map. I was nearly 80 miles east of where I should have been. I don't know how. When I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, the road behind me was empty, just desert and dust. A few weeks later, I tried to find Hollow Creek online. Nothing. Not a map listing, not a single mention anywhere. Even the old road I'd taken didn't show up on satellite view. It was just empty terrain. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that place. I see the fog rolling in, the candle burning on the altar, and the woman's face shifting in and out of focus. And sometimes, when I wake up, I swear I can still smell the desert rain. Story the end. It was the kind of August evening that felt heavier than usual. The sun was already slipping behind the rolling hills, streaking the sky with bruised shades of orange and purple, and a faint wind rustled through the cornfields that stretched endlessly on either side of Highway 62. Chris had always loved road trips, but this one felt different. The map said the nearest town was 30 miles away, yet the further he drove, the more the world seemed to shrink down to just him, the truck and the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. He glanced at the gas gauge and realized he was barely halfway full. Great, he thought, no gas stations for miles. He was going to regret skipping lunch and letting the tank get that low. Chris's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, squinting at the screen in the dim glow. No service. Of course, he'd forgotten how quickly cell coverage disappeared once you got out of the suburbs. He tapped the screen a few more times out of habit, hoping for a miracle, but nothing changed. The screen stayed blank except for the persistent no signal. A twinge of unease gnawed at him, but he brushed it off. He had been out here before during college camping trips, and he always made it back just fine. He'd make it this time, too. The road curved sharply, forcing him to slow down. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just a shadow between the fields, but as he squinted, he realized it was a figure, a person. standing right at the edge of the asphalt. Chris slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering. The figure didn't move. He craned his neck, trying to make out more detail. It was tall, wearing what looked like a long coat, and for a moment he swore it was facing him, though the head was tilted unnaturally, like it was watching him from the side. "Hello?" he called out, rolling down the window. The wind carried his voice away. The figure didn't move. Panic crept up his spine. He wanted to reverse, but something in him made him inch forward instead. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. As he got closer, the figure took a step. Chris froze. Its movement was jerky, unnatural, almost mechanical. He gunned the engine and swerved past it, the truck tires kicking up dust and gravel. When he looked in the rear-view mirror, the figure wasn't on the road anymore. It had disappeared. Chris laughed nervously, his hand gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. "Okay, just my eyes playing tricks. Nothing out here but corn and empty fields." He tried to settle his breathing, willing himself to calm down. The sky darkened further, and the moon struggled to rise above thick clouds. The corn on either side of the road rustled louder now, as if whispering to each other. Chris's stomach tightened. Every horror story he had ever scoffed at suddenly seemed very plausible. He shook his head. "Stop it," he muttered. "You're fine. Just drive. Just drive." He drove in tense silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the tires on the road and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Then he saw the sign, a small, faded wooden board that read, "Rest Area, 1 mile." Relief flooded him. He would pull over, stretch, maybe call for directions. He eased the truck off the road, the gravel crunching under the tires, and parked near a dilapidated building that might have once been a restroom. He stepped out, the smell of wet earth filling his nose. It was eerily quiet. As he walked toward the building, he noticed something odd. The door to the restroom was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. He frowned. In the middle of nowhere, with no one around, who would leave the door open? Shrugging, he chalked it up to neglect, but then he heard it, a faint scraping sound. His stomach dropped. He froze, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. It came again, closer this time. Chris turned quickly, searching the darkness around him. There was nothing, just the cornfields and the road that led nowhere. He took a cautious step back toward the truck. The sound followed him, subtle but unmistakable, like nails dragging across concrete. He reached the truck and slammed the door shut, fumbling to lock it. He leaned against it, trying to convince himself he had imagined the sound. Then he saw movement in the side mirror. Not the kind that might be a tree swaying in the wind. This was deliberate. Something large and dark was moving between the rows of corn. It stopped when he moved. Chris's hands shook as he started the truck, the engine roaring to life. The thing moved again, stepping onto the road behind him. Chris hit the gas. The truck shuddered over a rough patch of asphalt, but the shadow kept pace, gliding across the road without the sound of tires or footsteps. Chris's throat was dry and sweat ran down his temples. He slammed the steering wheel, trying to control the shaking. Suddenly, a figure appeared directly in the middle of the road. Chris slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. He swerved hard, tires skidding, and the truck fishtailed across the asphalt. When he managed to straighten out, the road was empty. His hands were white-knuckled around the wheel. He didn't slow down, not even for the turns that could have easily sent the truck into a ditch. Every muscle in his body was tense, every sense alert. Then in the distance, he saw lights, faint, orange, like lanterns. He didn't know if it was another rest area or something else, but it was a place, and place meant people. Maybe he could get help there. The lights got closer, but the closer they came, the more irregular they seemed. They flickered, dimmed, then reappeared. And then Chris realized something that made him go cold. The lights weren't on poles or buildings. They were moving, slowly, methodically approaching the truck from the fields on either side. He tried to keep his eyes on the road, but the lights kept shifting in his peripheral vision. 1 second, a pair of them would be on the left. The next, 2 more would be on the right. It was as if they were circling him. Panic surged, and he hit the gas harder. The truck roared forward, and the lights retreated into the darkness. Chris didn't stop until the road curved and dipped into a valley. A small bridge crossed a shallow creek, and he could see faint signs of life ahead. A single farmhouse, lights on in the windows. Relief almost made him laugh. He had made it. He would be safe. As he drove closer, though, the relief curdled into unease. The farmhouse was unlike any he had seen before. The paint was peeling, the roof sagging in strange angles, and the windows seemed too dark, like they were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. There was no smoke from a chimney, no sound of life, just the faint glow of lights behind windows that shouldn't have been illuminated at all. Chris slowed, debating whether to stop or just keep driving. His instinct screamed at him to keep going, but desperation won over fear. Maybe someone inside could call for help. Maybe there was a phone. Maybe he could fill his tank if there was a generator. He parked at the edge of the gravel driveway and got out. The grass was tall, soaking his jeans with dew. The lights inside flickered once more, then went out entirely. Chris's stomach sank. He knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. Footsteps, or the sound of them, echoed from the dark interior. His heart leapt. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. "I need help." A pause. Then, softly, a voice, old and raspy, like someone had been speaking through decades of dust and rot. "You shouldn't be here." Chris stumbled back. I just need help, please. I'm stuck out here. My car." The voice didn't respond. Instead, he heard it moving. A shuffling, scraping sound across the wooden floors, then silence. Chris's eyes darted to the windows. One of them was slightly ajar. A shadow passed by it, then another, and another. The hair on his arms stood on end. He turned to run back to the truck, but the driveway seemed to stretch longer than it should, the farmhouse looming larger and closer with every step. Panic ripped through him. He broke into a sprint, but something grabbed his ankle, cold and hard. He tripped, slamming into the gravel. He looked down. Nothing. Just gravel. His breath came in ragged gasps. He scrambled to his feet and ran to the truck, dove inside, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life. As he backed onto the road, headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. Hundreds of figures, standing between the cornfields and the edge of the forest, all facing him. Motionless. Watching. Chris didn't stop. The truck sped down the road, headlights cutting through the darkness, every shadow seeming alive. For what felt like hours, he drove, the only sound the wail of the engine and the occasional thud of something hitting the truck's roof. He didn't dare look behind him again. Then, just when he thought he might never escape, the forest thinned. The road became familiar. He recognized a familiar highway sign. He was close to civilization. The streetlights of a small town appeared in the distance. Chris slowed, tears streaming down his face, chest heaving. When he reached the first gas station, he parked and ran inside, slamming the door behind him. The attendant, an older man with a kind face, looked up from his newspaper. "Rough night?" he asked casually. Chris tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He just pointed at the road behind him. The man followed his gaze, then shook his head. Nothing out there but empty fields and some old corn. Chris swallowed hard. He didn't mention the farmhouse. He didn't mention the figures. He didn't mention the lights that had followed him. Some things, he realized, were better left unspoken. He filled the tank, paid in cash, and left without another word. Behind him, the cornfields stretched endlessly, silent and dark. He didn't look back, and he didn't stop until he reached the safety of the city lights, where the night felt like just another ordinary night, and the horrors of the middle of nowhere seemed almost impossible. But he never drove Highway 62 again. Story the end. The road had been empty for miles, and the sun was starting to sink behind the tree line, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked asphalt. I had been driving since morning, heading out of my hometown in Pennsylvania toward a small cabin my friend Jared had rented in the middle of nowhere. The GPS had started glitching hours ago, recalculating endlessly as if it had given up entirely on guiding me. My phone had barely a signal, the kind where texts linger in the outbox for hours before deciding whether or not to go through. I should have turned back then. I should have, but I didn't. It was just past 6 when I finally saw the turnoff Jared had mentioned. It was little more than a dirt path branching sharply from the highway, barely visible under the dying light. I slowed the car, checking my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me, nothing ahead either, just an unbroken line of dark forest, the trees leaning together like they were whispering to each other. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was fine. I'd seen this place on Google Maps. It existed. It was real. The dirt road was rough, full of ruts and potholes, and the car bounced more than it rolled. Gravel crunched under my tires as I tried to keep a steady pace, and the air smelled like wet earth and decaying leaves. The forest on both sides was dense, older than anything in my hometown, branches so thick they blocked the sun in patches. Somewhere far away, a crow cawed, and I jumped, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the open air. After nearly an hour of this, I saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, dark and squat, with a single dim light glowing through a window on the far side. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, lazy spirals, carrying the scent of wood smoke, though the rest of the property looked deserted. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes. My legs felt stiff after the long drive, and the air was cool, almost cold, a sharp contrast to the heat in my car. "Jared?" I called, my voice sounding small and fragile against the backdrop of trees. No answer. Only the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I moved closer to the cabin, my phone illuminating the path in dim bursts of light. The door was unlocked, just as Jared had said it would be, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was modest but cozy, all wood and warm shadows. A small fireplace sat against the far wall, a log burning slowly, giving off enough heat to take the chill off my skin. A couch, a couple of chairs, a small kitchen, all of it simple and rustic. But the place was empty. Jared wasn't here. My stomach sank a little, but I told myself he'd probably gone for a walk, or maybe he had been stuck in traffic and had texted me to come in. I called his number, straight to voicemail. Called again. Same thing. My unease started to grow. I set my bag down and tried to settle, telling myself I'd wait. It was dark outside now, the forest pressing against the windows, black and unmoving. Every sound made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through cracks in the walls, the distant scurrying of some unseen animal. Hours passed. I tried to occupy myself, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the fact that the Wi-Fi was weak, almost non-existent. I made coffee, moved from room to room, checking for any signs of Jared, but the cabin was silent. I was beginning to feel a creeping sense of isolation, the kind that tightens your chest and makes every small sound seem threatening. At around 11, I heard it. A soft knock at the door. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Knock, 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 knock. Jared? My voice cracked. No answer, just another 3 knocks. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the back of my car, my mind racing through the possibilities. Maybe someone was lost, maybe it was a prank, but the cabin was so far out it seemed impossible anyone would just appear. I opened the door a crack. Nothing. Just the darkness of the clearing, the forest beyond, and that low, almost imperceptible rustle of leaves. I thought I saw a shadow, something moving quickly between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I slammed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to calm down. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it again from inside. A soft thump upstairs, like someone walking across the wooden floor. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I knew the doors were locked. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, dialed Jared again, but this time it went straight to a strange, garbled message, like someone had hacked the line. A low static hummed in the background, punctuated by faint whispers I couldn't make out. I ran upstairs. The hallway was empty, the doors closed. One of them, the bedroom, creaked as I approached. I reached out and pushed it open slowly. Empty. But the bed was messed up, the sheets wrinkled as if someone had just lain down. I stepped back, my breathing heavy, and heard a soft, wet scraping sound behind me. I spun around. Nothing, just the shadows moving unnaturally in the corners of the room. I decided to leave. I grabbed my bag, ran downstairs, and out the door. The car was where I'd left it. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove. But as I pulled onto the dirt road, I realized I didn't remember the way back. Every turn I took seemed familiar, yet wrong. The trees were shifting, or maybe I was imagining it, and the road split in ways that hadn't been there before. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, tall, thin, completely black, like a shadow that had taken human shape. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there. I slammed on the brakes, the figure vanished. I shook my head, heart pounding, and tried to drive again. But the road kept twisting, looping back to the cabin's clearing. I stopped, panicked, and my headlights caught something else. Footprints in the dirt leading from the trees to the cabin. Fresh. I hadn't seen anyone leave. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I tried calling for help again, but the phone was dead. No signal at all. Something moved at the edge of the headlights, a shadow darting between the trees. Then another and another. I counted at least 3, maybe more, circling the clearing, keeping me inside. I tried to start the car again. The engine turned over, but then died. I was trapped. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning. I could hear faint whispers outside, impossible to understand, but growing louder, sharper, almost urgent. Then came the scratching on the windows, slow at first, then frantic, like claws on wood. I backed the car against the cabin door, praying it would be enough, and tried to stay quiet, willing them to go away. Eventually the noise stopped. The forest was still. I dared to breathe. I checked the clearing. Nothing. No footprints, no shadows, no movement. I could barely see the cabin in the moonlight, but it looked untouched, serene almost, as if nothing had happened. My rational mind tried to convince me I had imagined it, that it was exhaustion, nerves, isolation. I didn't sleep. I sat in the car, every sense on edge. When dawn came, I saw my chance. I started the engine. It roared to life without issue. I drove, following the faint memory of the dirt road until it merged with the highway. Finally, civilization. Cars, people, signs, everything normal. I called Jared. He picked up immediately. "Where are you?" he asked. I told him about the cabin, the shadows, the noises, the things outside. There was a long pause. Then Jared said, "What cabin? We never rented a cabin. There's no clearing there. Nothing. It's just forest for miles." I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" "The land out there," he said, voice low. "It's privately owned. No roads, no cabins. People go missing out there. The locals call it the Hollow. You shouldn't have gone." I hung up. My stomach twisted. I knew he was right. The place I had been, it wasn't real in any practical sense. The road, the cabin, the shadows, it had all existed in some twisted, isolated pocket of the world that didn't obey normal rules. And I realized with a cold shiver the thing I'd seen in the road and the whispers and the scratching, it hadn't gone away. It had only waited until I left the clearing. I never went back. I never spoke of it. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, taking some lonely country road, I see shapes at the edge of my headlights, black and tall, waiting. And I know, even miles from that forest, that the Hollow is out there, still watching, still patient, still hungry for the next traveler to lose. Story, the end. It was a Thursday evening in late October when my friends and I piled into my rusty Chevy Impala for a weekend trip. The plan was simple: get out of the city, drive somewhere completely isolated, and spend a couple of days camping. None of us had anything specific in mind, just a vague idea of the middle of nowhere that we kept joking about. There were 4 of us: me, Alex, Jenna, and Tyler. Tyler was driving, Jenna was navigating with an old paper map, and Alex and I were in the back, arguing about the best snacks for survival camping. We left the city around 6 p.m., and as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the familiar hum of traffic slowly faded. The roads became smaller, winding through dense forests, and every few miles the asphalt cracked, giving way to gravel. The GPS signal became unreliable, our phones flickered, but none of us were particularly worried. That's the thing about being young. You feel invincible, even when you're driving toward the kind of place you probably shouldn't. After a couple of hours, we found a dirt road that seemed promising. "Looks like a good spot to start heading deeper in," Tyler said, turning the car onto the uneven track. The forest on either side was thick, almost suffocating, and the sun was gone. Darkness came fast, so we switched on the headlights, which barely pierced through the canopy. About an hour in, we realized we hadn't seen a single house or car, just trees. The road twisted and turned, rising and falling with the uneven land. At some point, Jenna muttered, "Guys, we're really far out here." We laughed, partly to shake off the nervous edge her comment added. Alex, ever the thrill seeker, started making jokes about how the middle of nowhere might actually be haunted. We all laughed a little too loudly, trying to sound braver than we felt. By 10 p.m., we decided to find a place to stop for the night. Tyler slowed down the car and finally parked near a clearing, surrounded by tall pines. There was no trail, no indication anyone had camped there before, but it was flat, and we had enough firewood to make a fire. We unloaded our backpacks, tents, and supplies, joking and teasing each other, trying to ignore the rising feeling of unease. As we set up camp, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, were barely audible. Alex mentioned it first. It's too quiet, like someone's holding their breath out there. Jenna rolled her eyes, but I felt a chill run down my spine. We brushed it off, thinking it was just the isolation. The fire went up, and the warmth eased some of the tension. We roasted hot dogs, drank beer, and told stories, the usual camping fare. Around midnight, Tyler and I went to gather more firewood just beyond the clearing. That's when I noticed something. A pair of faint, flickering lights deeper in the forest, maybe 200 yards away. At first, I thought it was some distant camper, but it wasn't moving, and there was no sound. I pointed it out. "Hey, do you see that?" Tyler squinted. "Yeah, maybe it's a flashlight or a lantern." He shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. The lights flickered once more and then disappeared. When we returned to the fire, I told the group what we saw. Alex laughed nervously. "Probably just a trick of the shadows. This place is giving us campfire paranoia." Jenna wasn't convinced, muttering about how old logging roads sometimes had squatters. We tried to ignore it, but the thought lingered. Around 2 a.m., the fire had died down, and we crawled into our tents. That's when the first sound came. A soft, dragging noise outside, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. We froze, listening. It stopped. Then, a few minutes later, a branch snapped, just beyond the clearing. The hairs on my neck stood up. Tyler, ever the brave one, whispered, "Probably just a raccoon or something. Don't freak out." But the forest had changed. The shadows seemed to move with intent. I could hear twigs snapping closer and closer. Suddenly, Alex hissed, Did anyone else hear that?" The noise was different now, a low, guttural groan, almost human, coming from the trees. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. But then, just for a second, I thought I saw a figure moving behind the trees. Tall, thin, almost impossibly thin. "Guys, seriously," Jenna whispered, "maybe we should just get back in the car and drive somewhere else." Tyler was silent, gripping a small hatchet he always carried. We listened. The groaning continued, low and deliberate, moving around the clearing in a way that made no sense. Then came the whispers, faint, almost indistinguishable, but definitely voices, saying things we couldn't quite catch. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind through the branches, but it wasn't. It was deliberate, and it was coming closer. Panic started to set in. Tyler stood up, flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Everyone grab your stuff, now." We scrambled to pack the essentials. The night seemed alive, the trees leaning in, shadows stretching. And then, as if on cue, the whispering stopped. Silence, thicker than before, pressed down. We ran to the car, adrenaline making every step feel surreal. Tyler turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine clicked once, twice, and then stayed silent. Panic turned into outright fear. We tried again. Dead. A shape moved at the edge of the headlights. I don't know if it was the tall, thin figure I thought I saw earlier or something else entirely. It didn't run. It just watched, and then it started walking toward us, slow, deliberate, making no sound other than the faint crunch of leaves. "Shit! Shit! Shit!" Alex screamed, pounding on the car roof. I could hear Jenna sobbing. Tyler tried to start the car again. Nothing. The figure stopped about 20 feet away. And then it spoke. Not words we could understand, just a guttural rasp that sounded like it was trying to form language, but failing. My mind refused to comprehend it fully. And then it was joined by another and another. From the darkness beyond the trees, more shapes emerged. They were thin, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too flexible. Eyes glinting, reflecting the faint light of the dying fire we had left behind. We didn't wait. We bolted. Out of instinct more than anything, we left everything and ran straight into the forest, trying to reach the main road. The cold, damp night air burned our lungs as we sprinted blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks. Behind us, we could hear the dragging noises, the groans, and the whispers following us. After what felt like hours, we found the gravel road again. Tyler flagged down a passing pickup truck, and we jumped in, panting, bleeding, and shaking. The driver didn't ask questions, just drove us back to the nearest town. We reported what happened to the police, but by the time they returned with a search party, there was no sign of the clearing, the fire, or anything unusual. Just dense, silent forest. No tracks. Nothing. The area was remote, sure, but there was no way anything could vanish that completely. In the following days, we each tried to piece together what happened. Some nights, I'd wake up to whispers, thinking I was alone. Alex said he saw shadows moving just outside his apartment window. Jenna refused to go camping again. Tyler kept talking about going back to find answers, though none of us had the courage. Months later, I was scrolling through a news site when I saw an article about a missing hiker, last seen near a remote area in the same forest we had been in. No body was found. The description of his disappearance, it was eerily similar to what we had experienced. We never went back. None of us have. Sometimes, when driving through rural roads, I see shapes at the edge of the trees in my headlights. Thin, impossibly thin, watching, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that if I ever went back, they'd be ready. Every now and then, I think about that night, about the whispers, the dragging sounds, the shapes moving just beyond our sight, about how the middle of nowhere isn't just isolation. It's something alive, something patient, something that waits for people like us to wander in and forget the rules of the world we know. And I know without a doubt that it's still out there, just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for someone else to make the mistake we did. Story the end. It started on a Friday afternoon in late September. The kind of Friday where the air feels heavier than usual, carrying a heat that shouldn't be there so late in the year. And the sky hangs low, with clouds that look like they could break open at any moment. My friends and I were driving out of Colorado Springs, heading toward what we jokingly called the middle of nowhere. It was just three of us, me, Ryan, and Tyler. Ryan was behind the wheel. Tyler rode shotgun, and I was in the back seat, scowling at the GPS that seemed determined to take us down roads that were narrower than my apartment hallway. We were headed to a remote cabin my uncle had rented for the weekend. He had described it as a quaint little getaway, but the Google Maps reviews hinted at something a bit more isolated. None of us really cared. We were looking for a weekend to get drunk, hike, maybe light a fire somewhere in the woods, and just escape the city. Cell service was already spotty when we left the main highway, but we shrugged it off. After all, getting lost a little was half the adventure. The drive wasn't long, maybe an hour off the main road, but the further we went, the more the trees closed in around us until the sky barely peeked through the canopy. The GPS started recalculating every few minutes, which made Tyler nervous. He's the type who reads too many survivalist blogs and watches too many documentaries about people disappearing in the wilderness. Guys, he said, gripping the dashboard, I feel like we're the only people left on the planet. I laughed, though my voice sounded too loud in the quiet car. Ryan didn't say anything, just kept driving, one hand lazily on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. Eventually, the GPS glitched out completely. It was just a spinning wheel. Tyler groaned. I knew it. This is exactly how people get abducted in stories. Relax, I said. We'll figure it out. My uncle said it's easy to miss the turnoff, but it's literally the only cabin on this road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of winding through trees and narrow dirt roads, we saw it, a small gray cabin sitting in a clearing, surrounded by nothing but forest. It looked innocent enough at first glance. There was a stack of firewood by the porch, a couple of old Adirondack chairs, and a rusty mailbox. But as soon as we stepped out of the car, a strange chill settled over the place. Not the kind of cold that comes from the air. This was deeper, heavier, almost like the air itself was thick with warning. We shrugged it off, of course. Unpacking, exploring the cabin, it was old but not run down. The floorboards creaked, the windows were grimy, but it was livable. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a wood-burning stove, and 2 bedrooms. No Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and the nearest town was miles away. Perfect for a weekend of isolation. That first night, we drank, played music quietly, and went to bed early. The woods were alive with sound, the wind, leaves rustling, the occasional owl, but nothing that seemed threatening. Or so we thought. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch hitting the cabin, but it didn't stop. I nudged Tyler, who was asleep on the couch. Do you hear that? He groaned. It's probably a raccoon or something. But the tapping continued. Then came a soft scraping sound like nails on wood coming from the back door. The cabin was small. The sound carried. I froze. Ryan, who had the bedroom closest to the door, hadn't moved. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the living room. The light barely penetrated the darkness outside the window, but I could see the shadow of something moving quickly behind the trees. My stomach dropped. "Guys," I whispered, "there's something outside." Tyler bolted upright, eyes wide. Ryan was still asleep, snoring softly. "What do you mean, something outside?" Tyler hissed. I shone the flashlight toward the shadow again, but it was gone. Just the trees swaying in the wind. I swallowed hard. "I don't know. I saw something move. I think someone is out there." We stayed awake for the rest of the night, huddled in the living room with the lights on, listening. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. By morning, none of us had slept more than an hour, and we were jittery. The next day, we tried to shake it off. Hiking seemed like a good distraction. We set out along a trail Ryan had found on his phone before the GPS lost signal. The forest was dense, beautiful in a way that made me forget the previous night for a few minutes. But as we walked deeper, it started feeling off. The trail, which had been clear, now twisted in ways it shouldn't. Trees seemed closer together, branches hung lower, and we realized we hadn't seen any wildlife all morning. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. "Guys, I think we're going in circles," Tyler said, scanning the trail ahead. I stopped. He was right. We had passed a fallen log we all recognized, a part of the trail we should have left behind an hour ago. Ryan frowned. "GPS says we're going the right way," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. We kept walking, but the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step. The forest felt alive, not in a good way. It was like it was breathing around us. Then we heard it. A voice, low, guttural, almost animalistic, whispering from somewhere deeper in the trees. "Did you hear that?" Tyler asked, panic edging his voice. I nodded, my heart hammering. "Yeah, we should head back." Ryan didn't respond at first. Then he said, "There's no one here. It's just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The voice repeated, closer this time and clearer. We could make out a word, or something resembling a word. "Go." We ran. Not a casual jog, but full-on panic running, breaking through underbrush and stumbling over roots. Every snap of a branch sounded like it was right behind us. After what felt like forever, we stumbled out of the trees and onto the dirt road. The car was just ahead. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and didn't stop until we were back at the cabin. We didn't speak much that night. We tried to pretend it hadn't happened. But then we noticed things. The firewood stack had been moved. Not much, just slightly, but definitely moved. And there were marks on the back door. Long, deep scratches that hadn't been there before. We stayed awake again that night, and this time we took turns keeping watch. At around 3 a.m, the tapping returned, faster now, more deliberate. And then through the window, we saw a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. Tall, hunched, completely still. Eyes? I don't know. The thing didn't move its head, but we all felt its gaze. We didn't see it leave, but by the time the sun started to rise, it was gone. We were shaking, exhausted, but we couldn't leave. Not yet. We had a car, yes, but the dirt road had become almost unrecognizable in the dark, and we had no idea if it was safe to drive. The rest of the day was a blur. We didn't leave the cabin. We barricaded doors, stayed in the living room, and didn't even talk. By nightfall, Tyler was pale and trembling, muttering that we needed to leave. Ryan was furious, insisting we were overreacting. Then the banging started, not soft tapping, full-on pounding on the cabin walls, as if someone or something was trying to break in. We screamed, grabbed what we could for weapons, and retreated to the bedrooms. The pounding didn't stop for what felt like hours. At one point, it sounded like it was right above us, on the roof. The ceiling groaned under the weight of whatever it was. I don't know how we survived that night. None of us slept. By morning, the pounding had stopped, but the cabin felt wrong. The air was heavier, as thick, almost like it was pressing down on us. We decided then and there to leave, no matter what. The drive back was silent. We didn't speak, didn't even breathe loudly. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been, the shadows longer and darker. At one point, I thought I saw something moving alongside the car, just beyond the trees, keeping pace with us. I blinked, and it was gone. We finally hit the highway and felt a strange relief. The city skyline appeared in the distance, and the feeling of being watched started to fade. But none of us ever went back. None of us ever talked about what happened, not in detail. Tyler still twitches when he sees a forest in the distance, and Ryan refuses to drive anywhere remotely rural. Years later, I still think about that weekend, about the scratches on the door, the figure at the edge of the clearing, the pounding that shook the cabin like it was alive. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had stayed, if we had tried to confront whatever was out there. I don't think we were ever in real danger from another person. I don't think it was a bear or a wolf or any animal. Whatever it was something else, something that didn't belong in the world we know. And it was patient, watching, waiting. Every time I drive past a dense forest now, I get that same feeling I had back then. The air gets heavier. Shadows stretch longer, and I swear I can hear the faintest tapping just like it was outside that cabin. Story, the end. It started out like any other late summer road trip. I was driving from my small hometown in Ohio to a camping spot I'd discovered online somewhere near the West Virginia border. I'd always been drawn to quiet places, the kind of spots that didn't have cell service, the kind of spots where the forest swallowed you whole. I had packed my car with all the essentials: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few days' worth of food, a cooler with water and sodas, a flashlight, and my camera. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I never do, but looking back now, I should have known. The sun was already beginning its slow descent when I left the last gas station in West Union. Beyond that, the road narrowed into a single lane of cracked asphalt lined with thick trees. The air smelled of wet leaves and asphalt, mixed with the faint odor of something I couldn't place. Maybe it was rotting wood. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't think much of it. The GPS on my phone was barely functional, flickering between maps and location unknown. That's when I should have turned back. Instead, I pressed forward. There's something about being alone that makes you overconfident. I had driven through back roads before, and I told myself I could handle this. The further I went, the darker it got, the trees pressing closer to the road until the headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead. The road began to curve sharply, winding through the dense forest. I passed an old, rusted sign with letters so faded they were unreadable. I slowed down, half expecting to see a house, a barn, anything. There was nothing. Just the road, the trees, and the silence. No birds, no insects, just the low hum of my engine. Then I saw it. A figure. I can't explain why I noticed it. Maybe because the headlights caught it just as I rounded a bend. It was a man, or what looked like a man, standing perfectly still at the edge of the road. He was tall, thin, wearing a long coat that seemed older than anything I had ever seen. His face was obscured by shadow, and I couldn't make out any features. I swerved slightly to avoid him, heart hammering in my chest. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I shook my head, muttering to myself, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was something else, something I wouldn't understand for hours. I kept driving. My car radio picked up static for a few seconds, then nothing at all. I turned it on and off, but it wouldn't work. The GPS flickered again, then died completely. I was officially off the grid. That's when the unease started to settle in, deep and cold, the kind that crawls up your spine and makes the hair on your neck stand on end. I tried to reassure myself I'd driven through worse conditions before. I just had to keep going. I came to a fork in the road. Neither direction looked familiar, and both seemed equally foreboding. I checked my phone again. Nothing. No signal. I debated turning back, but something inside me told me to keep moving forward. I took the right fork, telling myself it looked more like a maintained road. Mist was beginning to rise from the forest floor, curling around the trees and drifting across the road. My headlights cut through it, but the mist made it feel like I was driving through a tunnel of ghostly white. About 30 minutes later, I saw a cabin. It was old, made of weathered logs, with a sagging roof and boarded windows. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Relief washed over me. Maybe I could stop there for directions, maybe even get a phone signal. I slowed down and parked in front of the cabin, gripping the wheel tightly. The air around it smelled like damp wood and something else, something metallic. I knocked on the door, no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Silence. The door creaked open with a push. I hesitated but stepped inside. The cabin was empty, or at least it looked empty. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs hung in the corners. There were old chairs, a table with a rusted oil lamp, and a fireplace full of cold ashes. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the high, creaking ceiling. Nothing. I decided to leave, but as I turned back to the door, I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs. My stomach dropped. I froze. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But the noise repeated, louder this time, like footsteps. My heart was racing. I edged toward the stairs, debating whether to run or investigate. Before I could make a decision, the steps stopped. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I didn't stay to find out more. I bolted back to my car and started driving again, ignoring the creeping panic. The mist had thickened, making it almost impossible to see the road ahead. My headlights barely cut through the white haze. I slowed down to a crawl, straining my eyes for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. Another figure, but this one was different. This one was crouched on the road, like it was waiting for me. I slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The figure didn't move. I flicked the high beams on and off. When I looked back, it was gone. I don't know how it disappeared so quickly, but I refused to look for it again. I drove on, heart in my throat. I must have been driving for hours, or maybe it was just minutes. Time lost all meaning in that misty forest. My stomach growled. I was exhausted, eyes burning, but I couldn't stop. I kept thinking about the cabin, about the figures, about the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I caught movement in the corner of my eyes, shapes that vanished when I looked directly at them. My imagination was running wild, I told myself. It had to be. It couldn't be real. Then my headlights caught something strange. Tire tracks, but they weren't my own. They were wide, deep, and seemed fresh. They ran alongside the road, following every curve. I slowed, staring at them. They didn't make sense. There was no way another vehicle could have passed here without me seeing it. My car rattled over a patch of loose gravel, and that's when I saw the symbols. Painted in white on the road were crude, almost childish symbols, circles, lines, shapes I didn't recognize. They were spaced evenly, like a trail meant to be followed. My stomach turned. I didn't want to follow them, but my curiosity got the better of me. I edged the car forward slowly. The road began to narrow even more, and the forest seemed to close in from both sides. I could feel the mist settling into my hair, into my clothes, even into my lungs. The symbols repeated, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the middle of the road, arms outstretched like it was trying to stop me. I froze, unable to move. It didn't look human. Its limbs were too long, its head too large. It swayed slightly, like it was being carried by the wind. Then it was gone. Just like that. I blinked. The mist seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. I turned the wheel sharply, trying to get off that road, but the car skidded on wet leaves, spinning almost completely around. I slammed on the brakes again and came to a stop facing the wrong direction. My heart was pounding, sweat running down my temples. I knew I needed to turn back, but which way was back? Every direction looked the same. Mist, trees, and darkness. Suddenly, I saw lights ahead. At first, I thought it was another cabin, another chance for refuge. I floored the accelerator, desperate. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cabin. It was a car, old, rusted, sitting in the middle of the road. The doors were open, and the lights were on, though there was no engine running. A shadow moved inside, slow and deliberate. I slammed the brakes. The car was empty when I looked, but on the roof, scrawled in what looked like blood, were words I'll never forget. You shouldn't be here. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I backed up as fast as I could, spinning around on the narrow road, unsure where I was going. The mist was now so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Hundreds of them, echoing from all around me. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. They were coming closer. My car headlights flickered. The engine coughed and died. I was trapped. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the car, and ran into the forest, hoping to find the main road, hoping to find someone, anyone. The trees seemed to shift. The path I thought I was following twisted in ways it shouldn't. I tripped over roots, fell into mud, and kept running. The footsteps followed me, always following. Then I heard a voice, faint but clear. Why are you running? It wasn't friendly. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, something that crawled into my chest. I ran harder, screaming, crying, lungs burning. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. Time didn't exist. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. There was a road, paved, solid, and when I ran onto it, I saw a small diner in the distance. Its neon sign flickered weakly, but it was real. People were inside, eating, talking, unaware of the forest behind them. I ran to it, breathless, covered in mud, shaking. I burst through the door, and the warmth of the diner hit me like a wave. People stared, confused. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. I just pointed toward the forest. No one saw anything. The waitress gave me a glass of water. I sat down, shaking, unable to stop thinking about what I had seen. The next morning, I drove back to Ohio using the main highways. I never tried to find that road again. I never tried to return to that camping spot. Friends think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. I've spent nights awake, replaying it in my head. The mist, the symbols, the figures, the voices. Something in those woods didn't want me there. And I don't think I would have survived if I hadn't stumbled into that diner. I don't know what those things were or what they wanted, but I know one thing. I will never go into the middle of nowhere again, not willingly. And if I ever see that mist again, I'll turn and run, no matter what. Story the end. It started as a simple road trip for 4 friends. Me, Alex, Jenny, and Marcus. We had graduated college in the spring and decided we deserved one last hurrah before the real world swallowed us whole. The plan was vague but intentional. We wanted no cities, no crowds, just miles of open road, quiet towns, and a few nights camping under the stars. We loaded up Alex's beat-up Ford pickup with tents, coolers, and a questionable assortment of snacks, and headed northwest toward nowhere in particular, following what we assumed were less traveled highways. None of us had ever been on a road trip like this. It felt liberating, the kind of freedom only cheap gas, reckless energy, and a lack of responsibility could buy. At first, the drive was perfect. The 4 of us were singing along to a playlist Jenny had made, the kind that had everything from 90s alt-rock to modern pop, the kind that made you want to roll the windows down even when the wind whipped your hair into your eyes. We drove for hours, passing through forests, cornfields, and stretches of nothing that seemed to go on forever. Somewhere around midday, we stopped at a gas station in a town so small I think we saw more cows than people. The attendant, a sunburned man with a face like carved wood, barely looked at us as he pumped gas. When I asked if there were any good places to eat nearby, he just shrugged, muttering something about a diner 5 miles down the road, if you can call it a road. We laughed it off, thinking it was just a local's dry sense of humor, and moved on. The road after that stop grew narrower and rougher, lined with trees that seemed to lean in closer the farther we drove. Jenny, who had been navigating with a mix of Google Maps and instinct, mentioned we were probably in the middle of nowhere. Middle of nowhere is kind of the point, she said with a grin. I remember thinking she was right, the isolation thrilling at first. The 4 of us were seasoned city kids, and the emptiness felt like a novelty. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the cracked pavement. We started noticing signs that seemed off. Not in a supernatural way, but in a way that made your stomach tighten without warning. Hand-painted wooden signs pointing down dirt paths reading things like cabin rentals, quiet retreat, and fishing, lake ahead appeared intermittently. The roads they pointed to looked more like overgrown trails than anything you'd drive a vehicle on. Marcus joked about it. Yeah, right. Whoever made those signs probably hasn't seen a human in years. We laughed, but even then, I noticed the trees pressed closer to the road after each sign, as if they were trying to guide us somewhere or keep us from leaving. Eventually, we decided to stop at a small clearing along the side of the road to stretch our legs. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Even the birds were missing. Jenny commented on it, but Alex waved it off, insisting the bugs and birds were probably hiding from something. Marcus, ever the practical one, suggested we keep moving. But curiosity got the better of us, so we wandered into the trees for a little while. We didn't go far, maybe 50 yards, when Jenny screamed. I remember her voice cutting through the still air like a knife. We ran to her, hearts racing, only to see her pointing at something on the ground. At first, we thought it was a fallen branch or a log, but then we realized it was a tire track. Fresh tire tracks. And not just one, several, crisscrossing in a pattern that made no sense for a vehicle that had driven on a defined path. "No one's been down this road for hours," Alex said, frowning. The tracks were wide like a truck and deep, as if the vehicle had been heavy. But what unsettled me the most was how they didn't lead anywhere. They came from nowhere and vanished back into the forest, almost like someone or something had driven in circles just to leave us a message. We laughed it off again. "Probably some local farmers," Alex suggested. But as we drove off, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the woods, just on the edge of my peripheral vision. A dark shape that vanished the moment I tried to look directly at it. We decided to keep driving, trying to shake off the creeping unease. As night fell, the isolation became oppressive. The road narrowed further, winding like a snake through the woods. The moon was high but partially covered by clouds, making it difficult to see beyond a few yards. My headlights barely cut through the darkness. It was Marcus who noticed it first. "Hey, is that a house?" he asked, pointing to a dim light flickering through the trees. We slowed down, expecting perhaps a cabin or an old farmhouse, but when we got closer, it didn't look like a house at all. It was large and made of wood, but the structure seemed wrong. The windows were all different shapes and sizes, mismatched and at odd angles. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front porch was long, the boards creaking under an unseen weight. "Who would build a house like that?" Jenny whispered. "I don't know," Alex said, "but it's probably abandoned. Looks like it hasn't been taken care of in decades." Something about it was mesmerizing, though. Almost hypnotic. We parked in front and got out, the air colder than it should have been. The forest had disappeared behind a thick wall of mist that hadn't been there moments before. As we approached, the door creaked open on its own. Not blown open by wind, no, it opened slowly, deliberately, as if inviting us in. We froze. "Do we go in?" Jenny asked, her voice small. Alex, always the instigator, stepped forward. "We're not going to find out if we don't." I followed, Marcus hesitating just behind. The inside smelled of damp wood and something sour, like mold mixed with decay. The walls were lined with shelves, but the objects on them were all wrong. Dolls with cracked faces, stuffed animals missing eyes, strange tools that didn't look like they belonged to any craft I'd seen before. The furniture was mismatched, much like the exterior, and every step we took made the floorboards groan like they were alive. Then we heard it. A low humming, rhythmic, almost like chanting. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, and none of us could tell which direction it was coming from. "Alex, we should leave," Marcus said. Alex ignored him, moving toward the sound. The humming grew louder as we neared a staircase leading to the basement. The air was thick now, difficult to breathe. My skin crawled. Jenny grabbed my arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Something's wrong, really wrong." But curiosity or perhaps stupidity won. Alex descended first. The steps creaked under his weight, the darkness below swallowing him. When we finally mustered the courage to look down, we saw him reach the bottom and freeze. "Alex?" Marcus called. No answer, just the humming. We climbed down after him, and the basement was worse than anything upstairs. Shadows danced across the walls, though there was no light source. In the middle of the room was a circle drawn in what looked like dirt, or maybe something darker. Inside the circle, symbols were etched into the concrete floor, ones I didn't recognize. The humming came from there as if it were alive. Then we saw him. Not Alex, but something wearing Alex. His skin looked pallid, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at us, head tilted unnaturally. Jenny screamed, and the thing lunged. We ran. Marcus pulled me up the stairs while Jenny screamed behind us. We didn't stop until we were back in the truck, fumbling with the keys. I remember the engine struggling to turn over, the tires spinning on loose gravel as the mist thickened. When the truck finally roared to life, we tore down the road, the house disappearing behind a wall of fog. Every turn we took felt wrong, like the roads had shifted while we weren't looking. Headlights caught movement along the tree line, figures standing just out of reach, watching us, their shapes flickering like bad television signals. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. We ran out of gas in a patch of forest that looked identical to the one we had started in that morning. No signs of civilization, no cell service, just the four of us, trapped in the middle of nowhere. We decided to walk. The moon had disappeared, replaced by an unnatural darkness. Every step was punctuated by the sound of snapping twigs behind us, even though none of us dared look back. Eventually, we stumbled upon a road again, but it was unpaved, twisted, and unrecognizable. We kept walking, desperate, until finally headlights appeared. A truck pulled over, and an older man with a lantern stepped out. He looked normal enough, but there was something in his eyes that made me think he had seen far too much. "You folks lost?" he asked. "Yes," Alex said, voice shaking. "Can you help us?" He nodded, and we followed him back to his truck. As he drove us toward civilization, or what we hoped was civilization, the mist and darkness seemed to retreat, though I could still feel eyes watching us from the shadows. We never spoke of that night again. None of us returned to the area. Google Maps, strangely, didn't recognize any of the roads we had driven. The house, the tracks, the mist, it all seemed to vanish when we tried to recount it. But sometimes late at night, I can still feel that watching presence, the pull of the nowhere that swallowed Alex, and I wonder if we were ever really out of it at all. Even now, years later, every time I drive through forests or empty roads, I imagine that house waiting, doors creaking open, shadows moving just out of sight. I don't know what we saw or what Alex became, but I know one thing for certain. Some places are not meant to be found, and some roads should never be traveled. Story the end. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip. Simple, quiet, nothing more than a little escape from the city and the constant hum of obligations. I had convinced my three closest friends, Lisa, Mark, and Jen, to come with me upstate. The plan was a cabin rental I found on some obscure listing site, tucked so far back into the Catskills that the GPS warned repeatedly that we might lose signal completely for stretches. That's the kind of place I liked, isolated, peaceful, with the kind of emptiness that made city life feel like a distant memory. We packed Friday morning, crammed the SUV full of camping gear, snacks, alcohol, and far too many just-in-case items. The drive was uneventful at first. Traffic thinned, city noises faded, and the air smelled fresher, cleaner. The woods themselves were breathing on us. I remember Lisa snapping photos out the window, her face lit by the early morning sun, Mark playing an eclectic mix of music that alternated between folk and classic rock, and Jen dozing lightly, earbuds in, nodding along with some podcast we weren't paying attention to. The trouble began around mile 42. GPS started flipping back and forth between recalculating route and signal lost, the road narrowing as we climbed a series of ridges. Trees on either side grew dense, branches arching over the asphalt like skeletal fingers. It was beautiful in a frightening way. I remember making a joke about it being the perfect place for a horror movie, and Lisa, still snapping photos, laughed, but not convincingly. There was a tension building in the car I didn't immediately recognize, like the woods themselves were pressing in on us. By the time we turned off the main route onto the gravel path that would lead to the cabin, the world had changed. The air got colder, despite it being early September, and the forest seemed to swallow the sun. Shadows stretched in ways that didn't make sense. The road was narrow, twisting sharply around ridges, overgrown in parts where nature had reclaimed asphalt. I slowed down. Mark, impatient, muttered under his breath, "It's not that bad. Chill, man." I ignored him, gripping the wheel tighter. We finally arrived at the cabin around 4:30 p.m., and it looked like something out of a postcard, rustic and inviting. 2 stories, large porch surrounded by thick forest. The windows were dusty, giving the impression that no one had been here for years. I brushed it off. "Makes it authentic," I said. The key was under the mat, just like the listing said. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and mothballs. It was clean, but obviously unused for a while, cobwebs in corners, dust motes floating in sunlight. The first evening was perfect. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, drank cheap whiskey, and laughed over old memories. The woods were quiet, but not unsettling at first. That changed once the sun disappeared completely. Around 10 p.m. I noticed it, the kind of silence that isn't just quiet, it's heavy, almost tactile. Even the usual nighttime sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, rustling of small animals, stopped. Jen was the first to mention it, whispering, "Do you guys hear that?" At first, we thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was deliberate. Footsteps, or at least they sounded like footsteps, crunching on gravel circling the cabin. We froze, listening. Lisa swore she saw movement in the woods, shadows darting between the trees. I grabbed a flashlight, shone it toward the tree line, but saw nothing. Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed nervously. Probably a deer. Or a bear. The laughter died in my throat when we heard something else, a low, rasping voice calling a name. My name. Tom. Just a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. We bolted to the door. Mark fumbled with the lock, swearing, and I pulled the others inside. We double-checked the doors and windows, turned on every light, and tried to convince ourselves it was a prank, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every creak of the wooden floor sounded like deliberate movement. We slept in shifts near the fire, eyes peeled. The next day, we tried to laugh it off. The sun returned, the forest looked normal, almost welcoming again. I went out to inspect the perimeter, flashlight in hand, camera around my neck just in case. The gravel path leading to the cabin showed no signs of anyone else. No footprints, no tire tracks beyond ours. But there was something else. A set of deep scratches in the bark of a nearby tree, jagged, chaotic, and definitely recent. We decided to drive into the nearest town, a tiny hamlet at least 30 minutes away. Gas, groceries, maybe some reassurance. The drive felt longer, the forest oppressive in a way I hadn't noticed in daylight. The town itself was almost abandoned. One diner, a gas station, a couple of houses scattered along the main road. No one we spoke to gave straight answers. When I asked about the area, the locals were vague. People don't usually go that deep into the woods, one older man muttered. Strange things happen out there. Best not to know. Back at the cabin, unease returned stronger than before. That night, the sounds began again, footsteps, whispers, scratching at the walls. But this time, it was worse. The whispering voices weren't just calling my name. They were calling all of ours. And not just by first name, sometimes by full names, even nicknames we didn't use publicly. Mark, trying to prove he wasn't scared, decided to stay outside with a flashlight and a baseball bat. He didn't come back. Not after 5 minutes, 10, 20. We called his name, shouted, ran out onto the porch, the gravel path beyond the cabin completely empty. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. Just the forest pressing in, silent and unmoving. We searched until nearly dawn, going further into the woods than any of us had wanted. Nothing. And then, as the first light of morning broke through the canopy, we saw him. Or rather, what was left of him. Mark was standing at the far edge of the clearing, pale and rigid, eyes wide with terror, mouth moving, but no sound came out. His hands were clawing at his own throat. We ran. I don't remember much else about that morning, just adrenaline, shouting, dragging him back to the cabin. When we reached him, he was breathing again, normal, as if nothing had happened. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't him. Not really. He couldn't speak of what he had seen. He just kept shaking, whispering, "It's here. It's waiting." We agreed to leave immediately. The SUV was packed in record time, everyone silent except for the occasional sniffle or curse. As we drove down the winding gravel path, the forest seemed to lean in closer, branches brushing the sides of the car. Every so often I glance in the rearview mirror and think I saw movement. Shapes crouched behind trees, barely visible in the half-light. When we finally reached a main highway, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Cell service returned, Mark's hand stopped trembling, and Jen finally spoke. "We need to tell someone about this." We didn't. Who would believe it? A cabin in the middle of nowhere, whispers in the dark, shadows moving independently from the trees, and yet the scratches on the trees, Mark's expression, the voices, all of it was real. It's been years since that weekend, and the memory never leaves me. I don't go back to the Catskills. I avoid that part of upstate New York entirely. But every so often, late at night, I hear my name whispered, not over the phone, not in a dream, but just close enough to make me freeze, close enough that I can feel it pressing through the darkness. And I know it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. Friends who've asked me to go on trips since, I refuse. I don't drive into remote areas. I don't go where the trees crowd the road and sunlight is swallowed before it reaches the ground. I don't make jokes about horror movies anymore because I know what's real. I've felt it. I remember the last night particularly well. We had managed to drive a few miles down the main road back towards civilization, exhausted, tense, and silent. And then it started again. From the rearview mirror, I swear I saw shadows stretching across the road, long and thin, too fast to be human. The voices started softly, indistinct but forming syllables, our names again, calling us back. I slammed on the accelerator, terrified to look behind us for fear that whatever it was would actually follow. We didn't stop until we saw the glow of a gas station. I called the local sheriff, trying to describe what we had seen. He chuckled awkwardly. "Nothing out there but bears, folks. You're safe now." That was the last laugh I could stomach. He didn't know. No one does, not really, unless you've been there. Unless you've driven so far into nowhere that the world itself seems to vanish and leave only the feeling of being watched, hunted, and finally claimed. Mark never fully recovered. He quit his job, moved out of state, and refuses to speak about that weekend except in broken sentences, frantic gestures, terrified glances at dark corners. Lisa developed insomnia, constantly seeing shapes in her apartment's shadows. Jen? She avoids forests entirely, even small parks, and jumps at the slightest sound. And me? I drive the highways, I stay in motels, I don't take the back roads. Every so often I catch movement from the corner of my eye or hear a soft whisper carrying my name. I know that one day, curiosity or accident might take me back. And when it does, I fear there will be no returning. The wilderness is not empty. It never has been. And somewhere deep in the woods, that cabin still stands, waiting, watching, listening. Every sound, every word, every breath carries through the dense trees until it reaches the ears it wants to reach. And I know with an absolute certainty that it remembers us. We thought we could laugh at the idea of isolation, at the emptiness, at the peacefulness. But there is nothing peaceful about being in the middle of nowhere when the middle of nowhere is alive. It doesn't just watch, it learns. It imitates. It waits for mistakes, for hesitation, for fear to take hold. And when it does, it comes closer. I haven't spoken to anyone who's been there besides my 3 friends, and I never will, because the moment someone else knows, they might become interested. Curiosity is dangerous. Questions are dangerous. And the forest has eyes, even when you think you're alone. I still remember the whispers, the way they slide along the edges of my consciousness at night. My name, Mark's, Lisa's, Jen's, sometimes all together, sometimes one at a time. And I know, just as I know the roads I travel now are safe only by distance, that one day the middle of nowhere will reach us again. I've told this story to few in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might attract attention. Those who hear it look at me oddly, and some scoff. That's fine. Ignorance is bliss, after all. But I know the truth. I've felt it under my skin. I've seen its patience stretching over years, waiting for the perfect moment. And it is patient, so patient. Even now, I sometimes drive long stretches through the woods, carefully avoiding the isolated paths. But sometimes, just sometimes, I hear it. A branch snapping far behind, a whisper carried on the wind. My heart freezes. I glance in the rearview mirror, and I know somewhere out there in that dense living darkness, it waits for the next mistake. Story the end. I remember the road like it was carved into my memory in shadows and static. It wasn't the kind of road you plan to travel on a whim. Just a thin ribbon of asphalt, cutting through endless forest, twisting and turning like it had no regard for direction, distance, or reason. My friends, Jake, Mia, and Ryan, had all laughed at my insistence on taking the scenic route. We were heading to a small lake cabin I had found through a local rental website, a place nobody seemed to have written reviews about. It promised solitude and total immersion in nature, which in my mind meant exactly what it said. Empty, peaceful, quiet. The first hour of the drive was mundane. Jake kept teasing me about my off-the-map adventure. Mia was taking photos of trees and the occasional bird, and Ryan was scrolling through his phone, headphones in, oblivious. Then the road began to narrow, flanked by tall pines that swallowed the sunlight. GPS flickered between recalculating and no signal, which we initially found amusing. I joked, "Looks like we're officially lost in the wilderness." But the laughter died quickly when the first odd thing happened. A figure appeared on the side of the road, barely visible through the trees. A man, or what looked like a man, standing perfectly still, head tilted, staring at us. No waving, no movement at all. I slowed down instinctively. "Do you guys see that?" I asked. Jake turned, squinted, and then shook his head. "Probably a hunter," he said. But it didn't move, not even when I waved my hand. Then, as we got closer, it was gone, just gone, as if it had melted into the forest. We arrived at the cabin as the sun began to set, its light slipping through the dense canopy. It was older than the listing suggested, with a sagging porch and peeling paint. The front door creaked when we opened it, and the air inside was musty, like a forgotten attic. But there was nothing overtly sinister, at first glance. We unpacked, lit a fire, and tried to shake off the strange encounter on the road. Night fell hard and fast. The forest around us became a wall of darkness, the kind that presses in from all sides. That's when the noises started. At first it was subtle. A branch snapping outside, a low rustle in the underbrush. But gradually it became more distinct. Footsteps circling the cabin, moving on the gravel path, stopping just short of the porch. Ryan laughed nervously. "Probably raccoons," he said. I didn't respond. Then came the whispering. Low, barely audible at first, like the wind carried words meant only for us. I froze when I recognized my name. "Ethan," it called, drawn out and hissing. Mia gasped. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake joked again, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. The whispers continued, now overlapping, calling each of us by our first names. Not just calling, they were familiar, intimate, and unmistakably human in tone. We tried to lock the doors, check the windows, but the sound seemed to seep through every crack. The air felt heavy, charged, like the forest itself was pressing against the walls. That night, sleep was impossible. We took turns staying awake, watching the shadows dance against the walls, counting each creak, each scratch. By morning, our nerves were raw, eyes bloodshot and hands trembling. The next day, we ventured outside to investigate. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone else near the cabin, but the forest told a different story. Deep, jagged scratches scarred the trees, as if something had climbed or struck them with intent. Small, circular patterns in the dirt suggested repeated movement, almost ritualistic. I snapped photos, hoping to find a rational explanation, but the unease was creeping into my chest like a living thing. Determined to reclaim some sense of normalcy, we decided to explore the nearby lake. The water was dark, reflecting the sky in a dull silver. We tried to swim, laugh, pretend everything was fine, but the forest seemed to close in the moment we left the cabin's perimeter. Shadows stretched across the water, and when we glanced toward the tree line, we saw movement. Figures darting between the trees, fast and silent. By late afternoon, Jake noticed something unsettling. "Guys, look." In the sand at the edge of the lake were footprints. Too small to be ours, too large for any animal we recognized. They led into the woods, deeper than we dared follow. We turned to leave, but when we did, the whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent. My name again, Mia's, Ryan's, even Jake's nickname he thought nobody knew. We ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. We barricaded it as best as we could and tried to calm ourselves. But that night, the cabin became a cage. The whispering grew persistent, circling the walls, seeming to come from every direction at once. Then came tapping, slow, deliberate, moving from window to window. Our flashlights revealed nothing. My heart raced. Each sound felt like it was waiting for me to respond, to make a mistake. At around midnight, something changed. The air outside thickened, became almost tangible. The shadows shifted, growing longer, coalescing into figures at the edge of the clearing. They didn't walk. They glided, slow, deliberate, always just out of reach. I tried calling out, but my voice faltered. Ryan pointed to the tree line. "They're moving toward us." We watched in horror as the figures seemed to merge with the trees, appearing and disappearing, always silent except for the whispering, which now carried anger, frustration, and hunger. By the next morning, we agreed to leave. But when we opened the door, the forest seemed endless. The road was gone, replaced by a wall of trees so dense it felt unnatural. Our GPS mocked us with no signal, though it had worked hours before. Panic set in. We drove blindly through the woods, every turn looking identical, until we realized we were going in circles. The whispering returned, now inside the car, not outside, not carried by the wind, inside. Each name spoken clearly, intentionally, from the corners of the vehicle, from the vents, from the dark spaces behind our seats. Hours passed. We tried to scream, drive faster, but the forest had us. Shadows crept along the edges of the car, stretching, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. Mia screamed first when a hand, thin, pale, and impossibly long, pressed against the window. We swerved violently, the car nearly tipping over, but there was nothing there when we looked. Eventually, just as exhaustion threatened to collapse us, the road reappeared. Daylight filtered through the trees. We didn't speak. The lake cabin, the forest, the figures, it felt like a dream. But the scratches on our arms, the mud on our shoes, the terror still in our voices otherwise proved otherwise. We never spoke of it in detail afterward. Friends, coworkers, family, they wouldn't understand. And I don't think I fully understood it myself. We avoided the Catskills, avoided back roads, avoided forests that weren't clearly mapped. But sometimes, at night, I hear it, whispering my name. And I know the woods are patient. They wait, they remember, they follow. Every so often I get a message from Mia or Ryan, always brief, never descriptive. Did you hear it again? And I do. I hear it soft and slow, like a lullaby meant to lure me back. Because the middle of nowhere isn't empty, it's alive, and it remembers you, waits for the moment you wander too far from safety, and it comes. We thought it was just a cabin, just a forest. But it isn't. It's something else, something patient, something that waits, and one day it will find us again. Story the end. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a quick road trip for 4 friends escaping the crush of city life. Jason, Mark, Lila, and Carly had all been working nonstop for months, and the lure of empty roads, tall trees, and nothing but the hum of the wind through the pines was irresistible. Jason had rented a cabin somewhere in northern Georgia, supposedly secluded, quiet, perfect for hiking. None of them had really paid attention to how remote it was. That detail only became clear once they drove past mile after mile of nothing but forest, the asphalt narrowing, the lines fading, and cell service dropping to zero. They laughed about it at first, joking that they were finally getting away from civilization. The cabin itself looked cozy enough in the fading afternoon light. It was an old wooden structure, a little creaky, with a stone chimney and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The road leading up to it was gravel, winding through thick woods, and as they parked the SUV in front, the forest seemed to close in around them. There was a peculiar stillness to the air. No birds, no rustling of squirrels, no hint of civilization anywhere nearby. Inside, the cabin was dusty, but serviceable. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area dominated by a large stone fireplace. Jason fumbled with the keys, and when the door creaked open, the smell of damp wood and old pine hit them. Lila wrinkled her nose but shrugged. "It's rustic," she said. Carly immediately started unpacking her bag, trying to make the place feel less like a haunted postcard. By evening, they had made a small fire in the fireplace. The orange glow flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. They cooked sandwiches, drank a few beers, and settled into the quiet. At first, it was peaceful. The kind of peace that makes city people feel alive in ways they forget exist. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the crackle of the fire, a rhythmic rap, low and deliberate. Jason paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked. Lila shrugged. "It's probably just the wind. This place is old. Wood creaks." Carly tilted her head. "It sounded human." Mark laughed nervously. "Yeah, right, in the middle of nowhere, who the hell would be knocking at some random cabin?" The knocks came again, louder this time. A sharp, heavy thump at the door. Jason got up, peering through the glass panes. Nothing. No one. Just darkness and trees. "Maybe it's an animal," he said, though his voice betrayed a nervous edge. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. The forest around them seemed to inhale and hold its breath. He shone the light down the path leading to the gravel road. Nothing. Not a deer, not a raccoon, not a human. When he turned back inside, the knocking had stopped. They tried to shake it off, convincing themselves it was the wind, a branch hitting the cabin, anything but what it could have been. But Carly noticed something strange. The door had marks on it, scratches, shallow but deliberate, as if someone or something had tried to claw it open. The next morning, they decided to hike. The trailhead wasn't far, but already they felt the isolation pressing on them. The forest was thick, the canopy dense, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. Birds called occasionally, but in an odd, uneven rhythm. Lila whispered that the woods felt alive, watching them. Jason laughed at her, but even he felt it, a subtle tension, like the air itself was waiting. They wandered for hours. Everything was normal, almost too normal. At one point, they reached a clearing with a small, stagnant pond. Carly suggested they rest, and as they sat on fallen logs, Mark joked about urban legends, the kind of stories where hikers vanish without a trace. They all laughed, but the laughter didn't reach their eyes. That night, the knocks returned, louder, more insistent. They pounded against the cabin walls, echoing like someone circling the structure, then paused. A silence so heavy it pressed against their ears. Then the scratching started, soft, slow, moving along the wooden siding. Jason went to the door, but the forest was empty, shrouded in darkness. He called out, but his voice seemed to vanish into the night. The next day, Carly noticed the first sign that things were wrong. Her backpack, left in the corner of the living room, had been moved. Not by much, maybe a foot, but she was certain she hadn't touched it. She told the others, but they laughed it off again. "You're tired," Jason said. "We're all tired. Weird stuff happens in the woods when you're exhausted." But as the day dragged on, the strange occurrences grew. Footprints appeared on the porch overnight, deep, large, and bare. They led to the edge of the woods and vanished. The food they had left in the kitchen sometimes went missing, only to reappear in strange places, a loaf of bread on the roof, a half-eaten sandwich in the bathtub. At first, they convinced themselves one of them was playing a prank. On the third night, the scratching became a whispering. Not words, exactly, but a low, sibilant sound that seemed to mimic human speech. Carly swore she heard her name. Lila heard it too. Jason and Mark, however, heard nothing. Fear began to seep into their bones, a creeping cold that no fire could chase away. Desperate, Jason suggested they leave, but when they tried to drive back, the gravel road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting through the trees in ways they didn't remember. Landmarks were gone, the cabin invisible behind them as if swallowed by the forest. Their GPS was dead, the cell signal non-existent. They were trapped in a loop of trees and shadows. By the fourth night, paranoia had taken hold. They barricaded the doors, covered windows, and slept in shifts, listening to the wind or whatever moved outside. Mark swore he saw figures between the trees, hunched, moving against the grain of the forest. Lila insisted she saw someone standing at the edge of the clearing during the day, just watching. Carly started talking about the eyes she felt on her, following her movements, never blinking, always patient. That night, the knocks came again, but this time they were joined by a voice, a distorted, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Go. Away," it said. Not quite human, not quite animal. Jason grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, screaming into the dark, but the beam cut through empty woods. When he returned, he found the others frozen, staring at the corner of the cabin. There, scratched deep into the wooden wall, were words, "Leave now." They debated leaving at dawn, but by then something had entered the cabin. At first it was subtle, cold spots, fleeting shadows, objects moving when no one was looking. Then it became violent. Windows shattered, doors slammed, and the whispers grew into screams. Jason tried to call for help again, but the phone remained dead, mocking him. When daylight came, they tried to escape on foot, but the forest had changed. Trails led back to the cabin, not forward. Every direction was wrong, every turn doubled them back to the place they had desperately wanted to leave. Hunger and exhaustion made panic a constant companion. At night, the cabin seemed alive, breathing, waiting for them to falter. By the fifth night, they were in a state of total terror. Carly and Lila refused to leave the cabin anymore, insisting it was safer inside. Jason and Mark argued they had to keep moving. That's when the first one disappeared. Carly awoke to find Lila missing. The window she had slept next to was wide open, snow-like dust floating in the weak morning light. Carly screamed for Lila, running into the woods, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign, nothing but silence. Jason and Mark refused to believe it. "She wandered off," Jason said. "She's fine." But when they went outside, the forest was empty, as though it had swallowed her completely. The gravel road was gone. The trees pressed in, taller, darker, and the shadows were thicker than they should be at noon. Hours turned to days. They survived on the scraps they could find in the cabin. The forest never seemed to tire, never gave way. At night, the sounds returned. Scratching, whispers, knocks that rattled the boards as though the cabin itself were screaming. They began to see shapes in the corners of their vision, fleeting forms that vanished when looked at directly. Jason, driven by panic, eventually decided to leave alone. He told Mark to stay and hide, promising he would find help, but he never returned. Mark, alone now, barricaded himself in the living room, listening to the endless night. He spoke to himself, tried to rationalize, tried to map the forest, but it twisted in impossible ways. The cabin became a prison, the forest an enemy. On the seventh night, Mark woke to the whispering again. He thought he recognized the voice, Jason's, calling his name. Trembling, he crawled to the door, trying to convince himself it was a hallucination. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a figure, hunched and dragging itself across the floor toward him. He screamed, backing into the fireplace. The figure didn't speak, didn't pause. It just moved, relentless, dragging something behind it. Mark ran. He ran through the cabin, down the porch, into the forest. The trees grabbed at him with unseen hands. The forest floor shifted beneath his feet. He called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. Weeks later, a park ranger found the SUV at the start of the gravel road. It was abandoned, keys in the ignition, bags still inside, and a few beer bottles on the floor. Beyond that, there was no trace of the friends. The cabin had vanished. The forest looked untouched, normal, as if no one had ever driven through it. Locals whispered about the woods that don't let go, but no one could explain it. To this day, travelers occasionally report strange sounds along that road. Knocks, scratching, whispers calling names. Hikers sometimes disappear without a trace, their backpacks found in impossible places. Some claim to see a cabin deep in the trees, though no map will ever show its location. And those who encounter it say the forest seems to watch, patient, waiting for the next unwary visitor to wander too far into the middle of nowhere. Story the end. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. 3 friends, Jake, Maria, and Tyler, had planned to escape the city for a couple of nights. They wanted to camp somewhere far from any trace of civilization, to hike, swim in a river, and enjoy a break from their busy lives. They had agreed on a spot that Tyler had found on an old camping forum, somewhere deep in northern Arkansas. According to the posts, it was beautiful, secluded, and had no cell reception. Just what they wanted. They packed the night before and left early Saturday morning. The drive started pleasantly enough. Their small SUV hummed along quiet country roads, and the radio played a mix of indie music and classic rock. The landscape slowly changed. The cityscape faded into rolling hills, which gave way to dense forest. Tyler drove, Jake navigated with a GPS that barely worked, and Maria sat in the back, scrolling through her phone while occasionally looking out the window. Hours passed, and the sun was beginning its slow descent when they reached the point where the paved road ended. From there, a narrow dirt road snaked into the forest. "It's right here," Tyler said, pointing at the GPS. "The trailhead should be just up ahead." They followed the road for another half hour, the trees closing in on both sides. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. They hadn't seen another car in hours, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the occasional call of a bird. Finally, the road ended at a clearing. A small sign, weathered and hard to read, indicated a trail that led to a river. "This is it," Tyler said, smiling. "Let's set up camp." They parked, unloaded the gear, and started hiking down a narrow path. By the time they reached the river, the sky was tinged orange and pink. The water was clear, running over smooth stones surrounded by high trees that blocked much of the fading light. They chose a spot near a large fallen tree, set up their tent, and built a small campfire. Night came quickly. The forest around them became a mixture of shadows and strange noises, rustling leaves, snapping branches, and the occasional hoot of an owl. They laughed nervously, telling stories to keep themselves distracted from the isolation. The first night passed without incident, though sleep was uneasy. Every little sound seemed amplified in the dense darkness. The next morning they woke to mist hovering over the river. Maria suggested a swim, and they waded into the water, laughing as the cold shocked them awake. After breakfast, they decided to explore deeper into the forest, following a faint trail that ran parallel to the river. Tyler led the way, marking points with small ribbon strips tied to tree branches. Hours later, the forest grew thicker, the trail less distinct. Jake noticed that the GPS was acting up. The path on the screen flickered and shifted, as if it were being recalculated constantly. "That's weird," he said. "It shouldn't be doing that." Tyler shrugged. "Probably just a weak signal. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember?" They continued, but unease began to creep in. The forest felt different the further they went in, quieter in a way that wasn't natural. Even the birds seemed absent. Then they noticed something strange. Footprints. Large, human-shaped footprints in the soft soil, but oddly spaced and oddly shaped, like the toes were longer than normal. Tyler dismissed it. "Probably someone who's been hiking here. Nothing to worry about." Still, Jake felt a twinge of nervousness. They pressed on until they came across an abandoned cabin, partially hidden by overgrowth. Its windows were boarded up and the door hung loosely on its hinges. "Should we check it out?" Maria asked, curious. Tyler shook his head. "No way. This place looks abandoned for a reason. Let's just keep moving." The sun began to dip again, and they turned back toward the river to camp for the night. On the way, they realized something terrifying. The footprints they had seen earlier were now surrounding them, but they hadn't crossed the river at all, and they weren't alone. Every so often, there was the faintest sound of snapping twigs just beyond the edge of the trees, always following them. They reached the riverbank as night fell, hearts pounding. They tried to convince themselves it was just an animal or someone playing a prank, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Tyler wanted to set up the campfire farther away from the tent to keep an eye on the forest, but Maria was insistent that they stay close. "Let's just stay together. No one goes wandering tonight," she said. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows across their faces. For hours they sat in tense silence, listening. Every branch that snapped, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline surging through them. Finally, exhaustion won, and they retreated into the tent. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the feeling that something was just outside, waiting. The next morning, they awoke to something that froze their blood. Their campfire had been moved. Not slightly, but entirely relocated, the stones rearranged, ashes disturbed. There were footprints around the tent, huge, human-like, far too big for any of them. Tyler tried to rationalize it, but Jake noticed something else. The ribbons he had tied to mark the trail were gone, as if someone had removed them carefully, deliberately. They argued briefly about whether to stay or leave. Tyler wanted to push forward and see the river further upstream. Maria and Jake wanted to pack up and leave immediately. Reluctantly, they agreed to leave, heading back the way they had come. The forest, however, seemed different now. The paths were unfamiliar, as if the forest had shifted overnight. The GPS showed them somewhere entirely different than where they thought they were. Panic began to set in. They ran, calling out to each other, trying to retrace their steps, but every turn led them deeper into dense, unrecognizable woods. Hours passed. Their legs burned, their lungs ached, and yet the forest refused to end. Every time they thought they recognized a landmark, a bend in the river, a fallen tree, they found themselves back at the same spot, the abandoned cabin. Only now, the cabin seemed closer, almost watching them. That night, they huddled together in the dark, too scared to light a fire. Around them, the forest was alive with noises, low, guttural growls, rustling branches, and the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to circle their makeshift shelter. They tried to stay awake, whispering to each other, clinging to the belief that morning would bring clarity, a path back to civilization. Morning came, pale and gray, but it brought no relief. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. The river they had followed the day before was nowhere to be found. They were utterly lost. Jake suggested climbing a tree to get a better view, but when he did, all he saw was an unbroken canopy of trees stretching endlessly. Nothing familiar, no roads, no clearings. Days began to blur together. They rationed what food they had left, drank from the river when they found it, and kept moving in what little daylight they had. At night, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. They could hear breathing close to their ears, the shuffle of massive feet in the underbrush, and sometimes faint whispers like someone or something was speaking just out of reach. One night, Tyler disappeared. Maria and Jake woke to find him gone, the tent unzipped and empty. His backpack remained, food untouched, They screamed his name into the dark, but only the echoes of their own voices returned. They didn't dare stay. They ran through the forest until they collapsed from exhaustion, their clothes torn, their skins scratched by branches. The next morning, they discovered something chilling, a circle of stones around a small, crudely dug pit, and inside, remnants of a fire that was too small for a normal human. The footprints around the pit were enormous, human-like but grotesquely distorted. The unmistakable impression of claws or elongated fingers was pressed into the soil. They realized with horror that it wasn't just the forest. They were being hunted. They moved silently from then on, avoiding open spaces, listening for the smallest noise, scanning constantly. But the forest seemed endless, and every turn led them deeper into the unknown. Sleep became impossible. Every night, they could hear the footsteps closer, the whispers sharper, more deliberate. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of being watched, hunted, and trapped. After what felt like a week, they found an old logging road. It was barely visible, overgrown and crumbling. Desperation overrode caution. They ran down the path, hoping it led to civilization. For hours, they ran, hearts pounding, lungs screaming for air. Finally, the road opened up to a clearing, and in the distance, they saw headlights. They ran toward it, waving, screaming. The vehicle slowed, and an older man stepped out. He looked at them as if they were something out of a nightmare. "You folks are lucky to be alive," he said. "Don't ever go in there again. That forest, it doesn't like people wandering around." Shaking, exhausted, they explained what had happened. The man nodded grimly. "That's why the old logging trails aren't used anymore. People vanish out there. Sometimes it's the wolves. Sometimes, well, some say there's something else." They got a ride to the nearest town, barely speaking, their minds numb. They never went back, never spoke of the trip again. Even years later, the memory of that endless forest, the footprints, the whispers, and Tyler's disappearance haunted them. The forest seemed to exist outside of time and space, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Jake and Maria eventually tried to return to a semblance of normal life, but the nights were the hardest. Every small sound, rustling leaves, creaking floorboards, distant barking, made them jump, made them remember the forest. They could never forget the feeling of being watched, trapped, hunted, and utterly alone in the middle of nowhere. Tyler was never found. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late September when my friends and I decided to take a road trip to escape the city for the weekend. We were college students, tired of cramped apartments and the endless noise of Philadelphia. Jared had found a cabin online, advertised as remote and secluded, perfect for a weekend away. The idea was simple: hike during the day, sit around a campfire at night, and forget about homework for a while. We left around 4 in the afternoon. The first couple of hours were easy, just highway driving and laughing at old inside jokes. But as we left the main roads, the GPS started to act up. It kept rerouting us down tiny back roads that felt older than anything we were used to, narrow lanes with trees pressing in from both sides. Every so often, the signal would drop entirely. My phone buzzed repeatedly with no service messages, but we laughed it off, thinking it was normal for a rural area. The sun was beginning to set when we finally reached the turnoff. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path, rough and uneven, flanked by thick forest. The trees leaned in over the road, creating a tunnel of shadows. We slowed, trying to navigate the potholes. "This is so isolated," my friend Alex said, half joking. "It's like the GPS wants to lose us out here." The dirt road stretched for nearly 10 miles. With every bump and twist, the forest felt denser, darker. By the time we saw the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a dim glow in the sky. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and squat, with a single light glowing from one window. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. At first glance, it seemed inviting. We parked, but when we stepped out, a chill ran through the air. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a damp, earthy smell. I felt an odd unease, the sort that creeps up your spine when something isn't quite right, but I pushed it aside. "It's just the forest," I said, trying to reassure myself. The cabin door was unlocked. Jared, our designated planner, led the way inside. The interior was rustic but cozy. A small living area with a fireplace, a kitchen with basic appliances, and 2 bedrooms. We set our bags down and explored a little, laughing nervously at creaking floorboards. But as we settled in, a strange silence took hold. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, like the forest outside is holding its breath. Around 9, we heard it. A soft tapping on the window. We froze. Alex moved closer. "Probably a branch," he said. But the tapping continued, deliberate, in a rhythm almost like someone was knocking. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the clearing. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the faint glow of the cabin light. Then it came from the back door. 3 slow knocks. We all exchanged glances, unease settling in. "Who would be out here?" asked Sarah. Another friend. No one answered. We approached cautiously. The back door was locked. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a loud, rapid drum. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. Only the whispering wind and the distant caw of a crow. We decided it was probably a prank, or maybe someone lost in the woods. We tried to convince ourselves. Hours passed. We played cards, told stories, and tried to distract ourselves from the heavy, pressing feeling that we were not alone. Around midnight, Alex went to check the generator outside, which powered some of the lights. We heard him shout, a short panicked cry that made our blood run cold. We rushed outside to find him pale and shaking, staring at the trees. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something out there," he whispered. "I saw movement, too fast, too dark. It wasn't an animal." We shone our flashlights into the forest. The beam cut through the shadows, but we saw nothing. Then we heard it, a low rustling, like someone dragging something across the ground. It moved around the cabin, circling. We could see branches snap in the distance, but every time we tried to follow the sound, it moved away, keeping just out of sight. We decided to stay inside, locking the doors. But the sounds didn't stop. Scratching on the windows, thumping on the roof, footsteps pacing the perimeter. We huddled together in the living room, eyes wide, hearts pounding. No one spoke for long stretches, listening to the relentless, unseen presence just outside. At around 3 a.m, it got worse. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The scratching intensified, louder now, more desperate, coming from multiple directions at once. We could hear breathing, slow, deep, deliberate. Not human, not animal, something else. Sarah screamed when the back door handle rattled violently. We all jumped, rushing to barricade it with furniture. The force against the door was strong, enough to shake the hinges. We grabbed anything we could use to defend ourselves, bat, crowbar, knives, whatever we had. Then it stopped. Silence. Too quiet. We held our breath, listening. And then a voice. Soft, low, almost a whisper, coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Leave." We froze, the words sinking into our bones. No one moved. We were trapped. The cabin, our supposed sanctuary, felt like a cage. We debated staying until morning, but none of us wanted to be alone for even a second. At first light, we cautiously opened a side door, peering out. The forest seemed calm again, ordinary even. But when we looked around the clearing, we noticed something chilling. Footprints. Tall, wide, humanoid prints circling the cabin, then leading back into the trees. Fresh. And there were more than one set, overlapping in strange patterns. We left immediately, abandoning the cabin. The dirt road seemed endless. Every turn familiar yet disorienting, looping back in ways that made our stomachs churn. And the shadows, the shapes at the edge of the trees, moved, keeping pace with us. Every glance in the rearview mirror showed flickers, dark shapes flitting between the trunks. By the time we reached the highway, the trees thinned, the shapes vanished, and the morning sun finally broke through. We didn't speak much, our nerves shattered, our minds replaying the night over and over. I never went back to that part of the country. I avoid isolated roads now, and I never ever trust a remote cabin advertised online. Some things out there in the middle of nowhere aren't meant to be found. And sometimes, even when you escape, they follow you. Silent, patient, waiting for the next time you wander too far from the world you know. Story the end. It was the middle of October when my cousin Danny and I decided to take a weekend trip. We didn't have much planned. Just 2 city kids craving something completely different. Wide open spaces, endless sky, and a break from the constant hum of traffic and fluorescent lights. Danny had this old Jeep he'd restored, and he insisted on driving north, deeper into the rural stretches of northern Pennsylvania, where the towns were few and far between, and the roads seemed to vanish into the forests. We left Friday morning, the air crisp and tinged with the smell of decaying leaves. The plan was to camp somewhere remote, maybe by a lake, Danny had read about online. Nothing fancy, just a tent, some canned food, and 2 backpacks. I had to admit, the idea of being completely disconnected, no cell service, no people, just the wilderness, was exciting. The first few hours were easy. The highway slowly narrowed to 2 lanes, then a single road with cracked asphalt, lined by dense trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a canopy that made the sun struggle to reach the ground. Danny kept glancing at his GPS, but soon the signal disappeared entirely. "We're officially in the middle of nowhere," he said, grinning. "This is perfect." At first it was. We passed old barns, fields dotted with scarecrows, and a few stray farmhouses. There were signs, mostly hand-painted, warning of deer crossings or cautioning about narrow bridges. It all felt quaint, almost picturesque. Then, somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller, darker, their trunks twisted into strange shapes. The road seemed older, with patches of moss creeping through cracks, and it became increasingly narrow, forcing us to drive single file around fallen branches. We passed a sign that read "Campground 2 miles" in peeling paint, pointing to a dirt path barely visible beneath the overgrowth. Danny suggested we check it out, thinking maybe it would save us the trouble of finding a campsite later. I hesitated. There was something about the quiet that made my skin prickle, but curiosity, or maybe just stupidity, won out. The path led us to a clearing with a small cabin, old and weathered. Windows were shuttered, but smoke drifted from a chimney. Oddly, a single light flickered inside, though there was no car, no other sign of life. Danny laughed. "Guess someone lives out here. Cool." As we got closer, I noticed the fence around the cabin was in disrepair, some boards missing, and the gate hanging loosely. The light inside looked artificial now, more like a reflection from a lantern left by someone who had long since gone. A chill ran down my spine, and I tried to shake it off. Danny, ever the adventurer, suggested we check the nearby woods for firewood. I agreed reluctantly. The trees around the cabin were unnaturally tall, their shadows long even with the sun low in the sky. We wandered a little way in, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, crunching over dead leaves, but slower and heavier than our own. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Danny froze, straining to listen. "Probably just a deer," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We turned back toward the cabin, only to realize it wasn't there. The clearing was empty, just trees and underbrush where the cabin should have been. "Wait, what?" Danny muttered, panic edging his voice. "It was right here." I tried to keep calm. Maybe I had just imagined it, or maybe our angle had been off. We walked a few steps further, but then the footsteps came again, louder this time. Not running, just steady, deliberate. I looked over my shoulder and saw a dark figure, tall, unmoving, just beyond the trees. "Danny, we need to go," I said, my voice rising. He nodded, and we ran. Branches whipped against our faces, roots tore at our shoes, but adrenaline pushed us forward. When we broke through the trees, the cabin appeared again, exactly where it should have been, but the door was wide open now, and the light inside had gone out. We didn't stop to think. We jumped into the Jeep and tore back down the dirt path, only to find the road ahead blocked by a fallen tree. We tried to turn around, but the Jeep's tires spun uselessly in the mud. I looked up, and that figure was at the edge of the tree line, just standing there, watching. The sun was setting fast, and a dense fog started rolling in, making it nearly impossible to see even a few feet. Danny revved the engine, trying to push the Jeep over the tree, but it wouldn't budge. The figure began moving toward us, slow but relentless, its shape becoming clearer. A person? No. Too tall, too thin, limbs moving unnaturally. Panic consumed us. We left the Jeep and ran, heading down what we hoped was a trail back to the main road. The fog thickened, the trees closing in. I lost track of Danny for a moment, only to see him sprinting ahead, screaming my name. I caught up, but then we both froze. The path had disappeared, replaced by an endless wall of trees. No landmarks, no road, nothing familiar. That's when the whispers started. At first, they were faint, indistinct, coming from all directions. Then they became words, clear, urgent, like voices we'd known but distorted. "Leave. Leave. You don't belong here." We ran blindly, tripping over roots, smashing through underbrush, until finally we stumbled onto a gravel road. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. The road seemed different, narrower, flanked by trees that didn't look like the ones we had passed hours ago. We were lost, deeper than before. Night fell completely, and the darkness was suffocating. The air was cold, wet, smelling of decay. The whispers persisted, circling us, coming closer. We debated whether to keep walking or to stop and wait, but neither option felt safe. Eventually, we saw a faint glow in the distance, lights. Real ones, not the flicker from the cabin. We ran toward it, and the glow turned into a small farmhouse, windows glowing warmly. A man appeared on the porch, waving. Relief mixed with disbelief. We shouted for help, and he beckoned us inside. Once inside, the warmth hit us, the smell of burning wood and cooking food grounding us. We collapsed into chairs, shaking. He made us tea, silent but attentive. When we asked him how far we were from the main road, his expression shifted. "You've been wandering the forest for hours. Maybe a day," he said quietly. "Sometimes people get lost out there in the middle of nowhere. Time doesn't behave the same way." We told him about the cabin, the figure, the whispers. He frowned. "No one's lived there for decades. The house has been empty since the old family disappeared. Some say it's cursed, some say it's something else. People go in, but few come back." We stayed the night at his farmhouse, too shaken to sleep. In the morning, he guided us back to the main highway. When we returned, the Jeep was gone, completely vanished, as if it had never existed. The road stretched on, perfectly ordinary, lined with the same fields and trees we'd seen before. Nothing out of place. We tried to explain it later, but no one believed us. Google Maps didn't recognize the roads, the cabin, or the paths we had taken. Danny and I never went back to northern Pennsylvania, and we never spoke of it in detail again. But sometimes, driving late at night on country roads, I swear I can feel it watching. The middle of nowhere, patient, waiting for the next people who think it's just a road, just a forest, just a place to get away. Story the end. The night had already fallen when Sarah realized she had taken a wrong turn somewhere along Route 89. The road had been empty for miles, the kind of emptiness that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel amplified. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating stretches of cornfields that swayed eerily in the wind, and the occasional abandoned barn or rusted-out tractor. She'd been driving for over an hour since the last gas station, and the gauge was hovering dangerously near empty. She tried calling her boyfriend, Mark, but her phone displayed no service. Great, she thought. Alone, stranded, and miles from the nearest town. The wind rattled the car, and she shivered despite the warmth of the heater. Something about this place felt wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The kind of wrong that doesn't come from isolation alone, but from the sense that the darkness itself is alive, watching. As she rounded a bend, she saw a figure on the side of the road. A man, or something that looked like a man, stood perfectly still, facing away from the road. She slowed instinctively, then her pulse spiked when she noticed he wasn't wearing anything recognizable, just dark, ragged clothing that blended into the shadows. She rolled the window down slightly and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't move. Her heart thumped painfully in her chest. She pressed the gas pedal, hoping he would step aside, but instead, he turned his head. His face was wrong. Not human wrong, but wrong in a way that made her stomach twist. Pale, stretched, like the skin had been pulled too tight over the bones, and the eyes, if you could call them eyes, reflected the headlights with a deep, unnatural blackness. Sarah slammed her foot on the gas. The tires skidded across gravel as the figure lifted a hand slowly, deliberately, as if signaling her to stop. Panic surged, and she swerved around him, heart hammering, and drove straight into the darkness ahead. When she looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. She tried to focus on the road, but everything looked the same. Endless stretches of corn, broken down barns, and the oppressive blackness of the sky. Then she noticed something worse. Shapes moving just at the edge of the headlights, between the corn stalks. Tall, thin, and too straight. They didn't run, they glided, keeping pace with the car, always just out of reach. Sarah's breathing came in short, frantic bursts. She had to get out of there. She turned onto a narrow dirt road, hoping it would lead to a gas station or even a farmhouse. The dirt crunched beneath the tires, the only sound besides her ragged breathing. The road twisted through dense trees now, the corn replaced with gnarled branches reaching like fingers. Her headlights flickered briefly, and in that instant she saw them. Dozens of figures, standing perfectly still in the trees, watching her. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles ached. She forced herself to drive faster, ignoring the rough terrain that threatened to toss her off the road. The trees seemed to close in, branches scraping against the roof and sides of the car. She dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The figures were no longer just in the trees, they were behind her, gliding on the road itself, keeping pace with terrifying precision. Sarah's mind raced. She tried to think, to reason. Maybe it was some kind of prank, some local legend come to life. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't human. This wasn't normal. She had to survive. Then she saw lights ahead, faint, warm, like a house with the porch lamp on. She floored the accelerator, praying. As she approached, relief flooded her, but it was quickly replaced by unease. The house was old, dilapidated, with peeling paint and windows that were too dark for a home. The lights flickered again, and for a moment she could swear they moved as if someone, or something, inside was gesturing at her. She stopped at the gravel driveway, her hands shaking violently. The wind howled through the trees, and the house seemed to lean forward slightly, welcoming her in some grotesque parody of hospitality. She stepped out of the car, feet sinking into the wet grass, and approached the porch. The door creaked open on its own. A cold draft hit her, smelling of mildew and decay. "Hello?" she called, voice trembling. No response. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped inside. The living room was empty, but the air felt thick, almost viscous, like it was pushing against her lungs. She could hear faint whispering, indistinct words that made no sense, but carried a tone of warning, of malice. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw them. Figures crouched in the corners, not quite human, not quite shadows. They didn't move toward her, yet she could feel their attention like icy fingers trailing over her skin. Panic surged. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls. Sarah ran to the windows. They were boarded, nailed shut, and the glass seemed thick and impenetrable. She pounded on the door, screamed, kicked, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, circling her, taunting her. She stumbled back into the center of the room, desperate for a plan. Then she saw it. The staircase leading down to the basement. A dim light flickered beneath the door. Against all instinct, she crept closer. The whispering seemed to call her name, drawing her toward the basement. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob, and the door opened silently, revealing the steps descending into near-complete darkness. The smell hit her first. Damp, earth, decay. Her flashlight revealed walls lined with old photographs, families, children, strangers, eyes scratched out, faces twisted into expressions of pain. Her stomach churned, but before she could react further, a cold hand clamped over her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. A voice hissed in her ear, dry and rattling, "You shouldn't be here." She bolted down the stairs, tripping over something that felt like a body, and landed hard on the basement floor. The light above flickered, then went out, plunging her into darkness. Shapes moved around her, circling, whispering, watching. She crawled forward blindly, the photographs crumpling under her hands, the walls pressing in until she stumbled across a narrow tunnel carved into the earth. Without thinking, she crawled through, the dirt scraping her skin, the air growing colder, damper. Behind her, she heard the house creak, groan, and then a sound like hundreds of footsteps converging, coming closer, relentless. She didn't dare look back. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small clearing. The moonlight spilled over the ground, revealing a narrow dirt road leading away. She ran, her shoes slipping in the mud, branches clawing at her arms. When she finally reached the road, she saw her car still parked where she had left it, headlights now flickering weakly. She jumped in, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As she drove back toward civilization, she dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The house was gone. There was nothing but cornfields stretching endlessly, dark and silent. But she knew, with a sinking certainty, that it hadn't let her go. It was still there, waiting, somewhere deep in the middle of nowhere. She didn't stop until the first signs of town appeared, the warm glow of streetlights finally comforting her. She never took that route again, and she never spoke of the night to anyone. But sometimes, when the wind rustles the corn outside her window, she swears she hears whispering, calling her name. Story the end. I left Salt Lake City just after dawn. my old Chevy loaded with camping gear, a cooler of food, and a thermos full of coffee. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the wide open emptiness of Utah's backcountry. Work had been crushing me lately, and the idea of getting lost for a few days was too tempting to resist. I told myself I'd follow whichever road looked promising, camp under the stars, and drive back when I felt ready. The morning was clear, the kind of pale blue sky that made the desert shimmer like it was made of glass. I turned off the interstate onto a narrow two-lane road that snaked between low mesas. The speedometer barely hit 50, but that didn't matter. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just me, the hum of the tires, and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the asphalt. By midday, I passed a small turnout marked by a cracked wooden sign that read, Cottonwood Flat, 13 miles. The road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to gravel, then patches of dirt. I figured I'd check out the area, maybe find a spot to set up a tent near the dry riverbed I saw on my map. As I drove, the scenery changed subtly. The scrub brush grew denser, and the mesas rose higher, creating narrow corridors of shade. The sky, once wide and open, now seemed to press down. By early afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying dust and the dry smell of sage. My Chevy rattled over rocks embedded in the road, but I kept going, convinced that a great campsite awaited me at the end of the path. Then I saw the first structure. It was a small cabin, half collapsed, sitting in a clearing surrounded by scrub and rocks. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagging. I slowed down, curious. There was no smoke, no sign of life, just the cabin staring back at me, silent in the heat. My gut told me to keep driving, but the thought of shelter from the rising wind made me pull over. I parked a few yards from the cabin and grabbed my backpack and flashlight. The door hung loosely on its hinges. Inside, it smelled like rot and dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. A tattered rug covered part of the dirt floor, and a wooden table leaned against the wall, one leg broken. I decided it would make a good spot to rest for a while. After setting my bag down, I stepped outside to scout the surrounding area. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh footprints. They led from the cabin's edge down toward a line of rocks marking what might have once been a path. I froze. They weren't mine. They were smaller, like a child's, and despite the wind, they were sharp and defined in the dirt. I shook it off, blaming animals. Coyotes. Maybe. Still, the unease clung to me. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door as best I could, and tried to eat some jerky while listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls. Around 6, the sun began to dip behind the mesas. Shadows stretched long, merging into the darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint knocking, soft and deliberate, coming from outside. My pulse spiked. I froze, straining to hear over the wind. Another knock, louder this time, on the door I had just secured. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the door. Nothing. The wind carried the sound away. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was a branch, hitting the wood. Maybe a coyote. Either way, I told myself to ignore it. Night fell quickly, the temperature dropping sharply. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor, eating the rest of my jerky and trying to make sense of the tracks. I kept the flashlight within reach and my phone charged, though there was no signal, just the battery indicator blinking. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a sound that froze me completely. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing the perimeter of the cabin. My chest pounded. I shined the flashlight toward the window, but the glass was grimy, and the shadows made it impossible to see clearly. The steps stopped. A pause. Then something scraped against the wall. Nails, maybe, dragging over wood. I told myself to stay calm, keep quiet, breathe. I gripped the flashlight, listening. Another step and another. Then a voice, low and guttural, almost a whisper. You shouldn't be here. I jumped to my feet, swinging the flashlight at the door. The beam hit nothing. The voice repeated, closer now, almost inside the cabin. I backed into a corner, heart hammering. Then the door handle rattled. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the door stuck. I scrambled for my pack, grabbed the small hatchet I kept for emergencies, and waited. Minutes passed, but the door didn't move again. The scratching stopped. The cabin was silent, except for my ragged breathing. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the hatchet, flashlight flicking over the dusty floorboards. When the sun finally rose, I peeked outside. The footprints were back. Not just the small ones, larger prints too. And they didn't lead away. They circled the cabin over and over as if someone had walked in a deliberate pattern while I slept. I didn't wait. I grabbed my gear, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. The tires spun in the soft dirt, but I managed to get onto the gravel road again. As I drove, I didn't look back. Hours later, I took a turn I thought would lead me back to Highway 6. I drove for what felt like forever, past mesas and washes that looked familiar but didn't match any map I had. Finally, I saw a faint glow on the horizon, a small cluster of lights. Relief. Civilization. When I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the same cabin, same clearing, same collapsed roof. The footprints were still there, circling the structure. I couldn't explain it. I tried driving away again, retracing my route, but no matter which way I went, the cabin appeared again, as if the road looped back on itself in impossible ways. My maps didn't match the terrain. My GPS was useless. And the wind carried that faint, whispering voice, low and insistent, calling my name from the shadows around the building. By the time I saw the highway, hours later, the sun was setting again. I didn't stop until I reached the next gas station, nearly shaking out of my skin. My phone finally caught a signal. I called a friend and told them what had happened, tried to explain the loops, the footprints, the voice. They laughed nervously, said I was exhausted, imagining things. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. I've never gone back. And sometimes when I drive through empty stretches of desert, I feel it. The same cold, the same whispering voice calling from a place that doesn't exist on any map. Story the end. It started on a Friday night, the kind of night where the sky is impossibly dark, and the wind carries that dry, hollow sound only the desert seems to make. My friends and I had decided to take a weekend trip to explore the back roads outside of Albuquerque. We were 3 hours out of the city, following a GPS route that claimed to cut through the middle of nowhere just to see how far we could get before stopping for gas. None of us were exactly experienced drivers for long stretches of isolated roads, but the thrill of the unknown kept our spirits high. By the time we hit the first dirt road that veered off the main highway, it was nearly 9 p.m. The moon hung low, thin and orange, barely illuminating the gravel track ahead. I was driving. Behind me, Jesse and Mark were joking about ghosts and desert legends, trying to make light of the silence that would occasionally fall between the hum of tires over gravel. The road narrowed quickly, and after a few miles, I realized we hadn't seen another vehicle in over 30 minutes. Not even a truck, not even a bike, just flat desert, dotted with dead sagebrush and occasional rocky outcrops. I glanced at my phone. No service. The battery was already low, and the GPS had started to lag. We didn't say much after that. The energy shifted in the car. Even Mark, who usually laughed at everything, was quiet, staring out into the dark. After another 10 minutes, I saw it, a small wooden shack, illuminated faintly by a single dim light swinging in the wind. We slowed down instinctively. The shack looked abandoned, but not entirely. Smoke drifted lazily from a rusted metal chimney, curling into the cold night. "Maybe someone lives here," Jesse said, a little too cheerfully. "Maybe they can tell us if we're even going the right way." I pulled up near the shack. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something else. Damp, rotting wood. The shack door creaked on its hinges as I approached. There were footprints in the dust, leading up to the steps. Someone had been here recently. We all froze for a second, exchanging looks. Then, ignoring the unease, I stepped forward and rapped on the door. No answer. I pushed the door open. Inside, the shack was empty, almost. The floorboards sagged under our weight, and old furniture sat covered in thick sheets. On the table, a half-emptied bottle of water and a tin cup. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a desert night. Mark whispered, "Did it get cold in here, or is it just me?" I shivered but didn't answer. Something about the place didn't feel right. The silence inside the shack was heavier than outside. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Not faint, not the wind, real, deliberate, coming from behind us. I turned. Nothing. I called out, but my voice sounded tinny and small in the empty shack. The steps stopped, then a whisper, so low it could have been the wind. "Leave," Jesse screamed and grabbed my arm. We bolted back outside, fumbling to get in the car. That's when we saw the figure. A man, or something shaped like a man, stood a few feet from the shack, backlit by the swinging lantern. His jumpsuit was dirty, gray, torn in places. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark. He didn't move toward us. He didn't need to. Just standing there watching was enough. I slammed the car into gear, tires spinning on loose gravel. The figure didn't move until we were about 20 feet away. Then it vanished, like it had never been there. We didn't stop. The dirt road twisted endlessly, each bend looking identical to the last. I kept expecting to see the highway or at least some sign of civilization, but there was nothing. Just the flat desert stretching into blackness. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw headlights. Far away at first, then closer, flickering like they were sputtering. Another old truck, boxy, the same faded blue color as the stories I'd heard from locals about lost travelers. We hadn't passed anyone. There was no other road for miles. The truck followed us for what felt like forever. It would disappear behind curves, only to reappear again, always keeping distance, always behind us. I floored the car, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly. Night pressed down like a physical weight. After what must have been an hour, or maybe 10 minutes, I can't remember, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another shack, identical to the first one, same swinging lantern, same smoke. I didn't even stop to think. I turned the wheel sharply, taking the next curve in the dirt road, but the shack stayed in our path, like it had moved. Like the road itself had shifted around us. The headlights were closer now. I glanced at the mirror. The truck was closer, but still far enough away to keep its shape blurry. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the road in front of us. A woman, thin, long hair, wearing a dress that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in decades. She didn't move, didn't react, just stared. I jerked the wheel hard, tires skidding off the edge of the road into a ditch. The car lurched violently, gravel and dust flying. Behind us, I heard a metal scrape, the sound of something large hitting something smaller. I didn't look back, I just drove. Somehow, in the chaos, we ended up on the highway again. The desert fell away behind us, and the lights of Albuquerque glimmered in the distance. I didn't speak for a long time. None of us did. Weeks later, I drove past the area in daylight. The road we had taken didn't exist anymore. The dirt path, not any shack. Nothing, just flat desert, empty, barren. I asked a local casually about back roads there. They looked at me like I was insane and said, "There hasn't been a road that way in 20 years. That's federal land, undeveloped. No one's allowed to drive there." I never went back. I never told anyone except my friends, and even they won't go near that road again. Sometimes, though, when I drive at night and the desert is still in sight, I swear I see headlights in the distance, flickerings, always behind me, following the curves of the road like it's waiting for someone to take the wrong turn. And I know I wasn't imagining it the first time. Story the end. It started with a wrong turn, the kind that didn't seem like a big deal at first. I was driving back from visiting a friend in Flagstaff, heading toward New Mexico late one Sunday afternoon, and my GPS suddenly froze. It wasn't uncommon out there. Long stretches of nothing but open road, no service, no signs of life except the occasional truck that screamed by. I didn't panic. I had enough gas, a cooler full of snacks, and hours before dark. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the sun hanging low and red, burning against the desert horizon. When I realized I hadn't seen a single mile marker in almost an hour, I pulled over and checked my phone again. No service. I got out, leaned against my car, and listened. The wind was the only sound, soft but empty. That's when I saw the dirt road. It cut off from the highway to the right, narrow, half hidden by overgrown brush and dust, leading toward what looked like distant hills. My GPS had frozen, showing some sort of side route in this general area, so I figured maybe this was it. The main highway hadn't had any signs for the last 50 miles anyway. I hesitated only a moment before pulling onto it, figuring it would cut back toward the main route. The dirt road wound through low scrub and dry brush, curving out of sight in some places, flattening out in others. The surface was uneven, scattered with rocks, but drivable. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, flat, dead land, and occasional clusters of cactus. It felt like driving into a painting that kept looping. After about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle since turning off. The road kept getting rougher, narrower. Then, up ahead, I saw something, an old gas station sign, faded and half-leaning, the paint nearly gone. I slowed, feeling a weird relief. Maybe there'd be someone there who could point me back to the highway. When I pulled up, the place looked like it hadn't been open in decades. The small station sat half-collapsed under a rusted canopy. The pumps were ancient, metal, flaking paint, the numbers frozen mid-rotation. A single garage bay stood open, dark inside. A weather-beaten sign above the door said, Cooper's Service. I parked, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The silence was so complete that even the sound of my car cooling felt too loud. I walked around the pumps, peering through the glass door. The inside looked stripped. No lights, just dusty shelves and what looked like old motor oil cans. A single stool sat near the counter, and a torn calendar on the wall read, June 1987. I was about to turn back when I noticed footprints in the dust leading around the side of the building. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. I hesitated, staring at them. They looked like boot prints, deep enough that whoever made them hadn't passed too long ago. The prints led toward the back of the building, disappearing around the corner. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but curiosity won. I followed slowly, each crunch of dirt beneath my shoes sounding louder than it should have. When I turned the corner, I saw an old shed behind the main station, metal, rusted, with a padlock hanging loosely on the door. And sitting beside it was an old pickup truck. It was a faded blue Ford, maybe from the 70s. Its windows were covered in dust, and the tires were half buried, but there was something odd about it. The hood was still slightly warm. That didn't make sense. I stepped closer, running a hand along the fender, feeling the heat. It wasn't the sun. It was too low now. Someone had driven this thing recently, but where were they? I turned and looked at the shed again. The padlock was unlatched, hanging open. I stared at it for a few seconds before I reached out and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Rot, thick and heavy, like something dead had been in there a long time. I gagged, covering my nose. The light was dim, but I could make out shelves lined with old tools, oil cans, and boxes. And in the corner, covered partly by a tarp, was something that looked like a pile of clothes. Except it wasn't. The shape was wrong. There was a hand sticking out. I froze. My body went completely cold as I realized it was human, a grayish, shriveled arm extending from beneath the tarp. I took a step back, my pulse slamming in my ears. For a long second, I couldn't move. Then I turned and backed toward my car. When I got there, I saw something that made my heart stop. The driver's door was open. I hadn't left it like that. I could see the interior light glowing faintly. My mind raced. Did I forget to close it? Did someone come while I was behind the station? I forced myself forward, checking inside. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the key I'd left in the ignition was gone. My heart pounded so hard I could barely think. I looked around wildly. Just open desert and the dead gas station, everything still and silent. I reached into my bag, fumbling for my spare key. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped it twice before finally getting the car started. I floored the gas, backing up and swinging around toward the dirt road. The tires kicked up dust as I sped back the way I came, the station shrinking in my rearview mirror. The sun dipped completely below the horizon as I drove, the light fading to that blue-gray twilight that makes everything look unreal. The road looked different now, less like a road and more like a scar cutting through the desert. I kept expecting to see the highway lights ahead, but they never came. After 20 minutes, I started to realize something was wrong. I should have hit the highway by now. I hadn't taken any turns. I slowed down, scanning the area, trying to find any sign of the pavement. Nothing. Just desert in every direction. I pulled over, heart hammering, and looked at my phone again. Still no service. The battery icon blinked red. I got out of the car and climbed onto the hood, hoping to spot something. Any landmark, a light, a building, but there was nothing. Just darkness rolling in. And then I saw headlights. Far behind me, down the dirt road, two faint beams appeared, too distant to make out the vehicle, but they were coming closer. Relief washed through me at first. Someone else was out here. Maybe I could flag them down, get help. But as the lights drew nearer, something about them felt off. They weren't moving steady. They'd flicker, disappear, then come back, like the car was stalling or the driver kept turning the lights off and on. I waited by my car, waving an arm as they approached. But the vehicle slowed down about 100 feet away. It just stopped. The engine wasn't running. I could only see the faint outline of a truck, an old one, boxy shape, the same faded blue color as the one behind the station. I froze. The lights stayed on, but no one got out. I couldn't see the driver. I felt a pressure in my chest. that animal sense of danger you can't explain. Slowly, I backed toward my car door, never taking my eyes off the truck. Then, without warning, the headlights cut out. Everything went black. The desert swallowed all sound. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I scrambled into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The lights from my car illuminated the empty road ahead. Nothing behind me. The truck was gone. I floored it. The tires fishtailed on the dirt, the car jerking forward violently as I tore down the road. My eyes flicked between the windshield and rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. But nothing followed. After what felt like an hour, I saw something, an old sign on the side of the road. My headlights caught it just enough to read, Cooper's Service, 2 miles. My breath caught. I slammed the brakes. My car skidded to a stop, gravel spraying. I looked around wildly. That wasn't possible. I had driven away from that place. I should have been miles from it by now. But the sign stood there, bent and rusted, pointing ahead. The desert suddenly felt like it was pressing in, like the whole world had shrunk down to this strip of road and nothing else existed beyond it. I turned the car around. I didn't care where I ended up. I just wanted out. I sped the other direction, watching the horizon, but the road wound endlessly, every curve looking the same. I passed another sign, Cooper's Service, 1 mile. I screamed, slamming my hands against the steering wheel. I didn't understand. My chest hurt from how fast my heart was beating. The wind outside was howling now, pushing against the car. My headlights flickered once, twice, then steadied. And then something ran across the road in front of me. It was fast, too fast to make out, but human-shaped. I swerved, narrowly missing it. The car spun out, gravel flying before coming to a jarring stop sideways across the road. My seatbelt locked tight. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely shift back into gear. I looked up and froze. Something was standing in my headlights. A man. Or what looked like one. He was tall, wearing a torn mechanic's jumpsuit, the kind with a name patch on the chest. The letters were too faded to read. His face was wrong, grayish, sunken, the skin stretched tight. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. He didn't move. I threw the car in reverse and slammed the gas. The tires spun uselessly for a second before catching. The figure didn't chase me. He just stood there, watching, until I was far enough away that the light no longer reached him. I drove until my gas light came on. I don't know how long I kept going, but it was deep night by then. The stars were bright, the moon low, but the road never changed. Eventually I had to stop. The car sputtered, coughing, and finally died. Silence again. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. My flashlight was in the glove box. I grabbed it and stepped outside. The air was cold now, colder than it should have been for a desert night. My breath fogged. The landscape around me looked endless, but now I saw something strange in the distance. Lights. Faint, flickering orange ones, like from a fire or lantern. I hesitated, then started walking toward them. I figured maybe there were people camping or another station. Anything was better than sitting in that dead car. It took about 15 minutes to reach them. The lights weren't campfires. They were lanterns, old metal ones hanging from hooks around a small clearing. In the center stood a house. It was small, wooden, weathered gray, like it had been there for decades. The porch light glowed weakly. A rocking chair creaked in the wind, though there was no one on it. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed faintly. No answer. I climbed the porch steps, the boards groaning under my weight. The front door was cracked open slightly. Inside, it was dark except for the faint flicker of another lantern on a table. The air smelled of oil and dust. I stepped inside slowly, calling again. Still no answer. The room looked old but lived in. Furniture draped with sheets, a table with dishes still set, like someone had been about to eat. A half-full glass of water sat there, condensation still on the side. That's when I heard the floor creak behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing across the room. Nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears. I backed toward the table, scanning every corner. Then I noticed something in the dust on the floor. Footprints. Bare ones. And they led from the door deeper into the house. I swallowed hard, following them with the light. They stopped in front of a doorway that led into what looked like a hallway. The air was colder there. My flashlight flickered. Then I heard whispering. Faint at first, like wind through the walls, but it grew clearer. Low voices, too many to count, all saying something I couldn't understand. My throat went dry. I took a step back, shaking my head. Hello? Who's there? The whispering stopped. I held my breath, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from the dark hallway, something moved. A figure stepped out. It was a woman this time, wearing a faded dress, her hair long and stringy. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her eyes looked clouded. She stood there, swaying slightly, staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, bumping the table. The glass of water tipped and fell, shattering on the floor. The sound snapped her head toward it with unnatural speed. She opened her mouth too wide, and a dry, rasping noise came out. I ran. I bolted through the front door, off the porch, and into the open desert. I didn't look back until I was halfway to the car. When I finally did, the lights were gone. The house wasn't there. Nothing was. Just darkness and open land. I don't remember getting back to the car. I just remember sitting in the driver's seat, shaking, clutching the flashlight. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The sun was rising, and I was parked on a paved road. Not a dirt road, an actual two-lane highway. I blinked, disoriented, looking around. There was no sign of the desert clearing, no gas station, nothing. Just my car and the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. I got out, still half in disbelief, and saw a green road sign a few yards ahead. US 191-1, 10 miles. I laughed, half in relief, half in shock. I started the car, it ran perfectly, and drove straight until I hit the next town. When I stopped for gas, the attendant asked where I'd come from. I told him I must have gotten lost off a dirt road near the Arizona border. His face changed when I mentioned an old gas station named Cooper's. He stared at me for a moment before saying, "That place burned down in '88. Whole family died there. Ain't been nothing out that way for years." I didn't know what to say. He watched me for a while, like he didn't believe me, then quietly said, "You're lucky you made it back." I never drove through that part of the country again. Sometimes, though, I'll be driving late at night and I'll catch a glimpse of an old blue pickup in the rearview mirror, far back, following just long enough for me to notice before it disappears again. And every time I feel that same chill run through me, the one that started in the middle of nowhere. Story the end.